Hey guys, welcome to part 6 of What If Sage Naruto Joined Akatsuki. If you enjoy the video then like, share and subscribe and also comment your thoughts as it inspires me to make more such videos and remember to check out my playlist section for other interesting stories. So let's get started. Chapter 21. The tension in the room was palpable, not that it fazed the 6 world leaders sitting in an elongated semicircle in the middle of it. The only one not sitting at the single curved table was Mifune, who sat off to the side at his own, much smaller table. As the neutral host of the proceedings, it made sense. And as the host, it was his duty to breach the topic of why the 5 Kage were meeting in the first place. As a neutral country, the Land of Iron welcomes you all, and while we have not heard much of this Akatsuki organization, I assume that it is a concern to all of you. It would certainly explain why both Lord Raikage and Lady Hokage called for a meeting. Perhaps they can tell us why this meeting became necessary. Tsunade stood up at the same moment as the Raikage, and the bodyguards tensed in the balcony as the 2 hidden village leaders stared each other down. After a second, the Raikage blustered forward, and Tsunade sat back down, willing herself to let it slide. Akatsuki captured the Hidden Cloud's second jinchuriki very recently. To be perfectly tactless, our spies have informed us that there is only one jinchuriki left to the hidden villages as a whole. Akatsuki must be stopped. The bodyguards twitched before settling down again once they realized that the Raikage's angry pounding was just that, and posed no threat to anyone but the desk in front of him. Both bodyguards and cages alike looked around for any clues as to which village still had their tailed beast. Seeing the other cages and bodyguards doing the same thing, there was only one conclusion to draw. And it was Mifune who drew it first. And I see that the one village with a tailed beast left is the only one not in attendance. Should we postpone until my messengers can reach the hidden waterfall? The other cages almost groaned at the thought of spending any more time in the Land of Iron than necessary, but the Raikage actually grinned. That won't be necessary, or possible. Akatsuki did attack the hidden waterfall to get the 7 tails, and they succeeded in wiping the village off the face of the map, though it remains so hidden I doubt anyone has really noticed yet. If there had been more people present, the Raikage's announcement would have no doubt sent murmurs and whisperings rippling throughout the room. As it was, the other cage and their bodyguards settled for wearing various expressions of surprise and horror. This is a most disturbing development, said the Tsuchikage, hand raised to his chin in thought. And I don't suppose you'll tell us how you've come to know of this attack. Information was power in the ninja world, and brash, young people like the Raikage showed off their power on a regular basis. So the wizened old man wasn't all that surprised when the muscle-bound cage tipped his hand. I know because 2 survivors came to my village, seeking refuge. One of them was the jinchuriki herself. With a dramatic flourish, the Raikage pointed up to the banner behind him, which bore the kanji for lightning. Fu stuck her head out from behind the cloth and waved at the assembled ninja below with a small smile on her face. Today, the world shall know pain, and through it, peace. Pain turned towards the other 8 members of Akatsuki assembled before him, in addition to Orochimaru's squad. Almost every member of Akatsuki had followers on their payroll, though Orochimaru was the only one who had any that were worth something in a fight. We shall go in, defeat the 5 Kage, and secure the jinchuriki. Where the fuck is Zetsu? Asked Hidan, with his usual amount of tact. Did the pansy chicken out of a good fight? Which Zetsu are you referring to? Asked Sasori sarcastically. Regardless, he's both inside already, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Naruto got up from his meditative position. There's a whole lot of samurai on the lower floors, but the only people up top are the cage and their bodyguards. There don't appear to be any barriers, but I've been wrong before. Pain nodded at the members of Akatsuki, and they all followed him towards the large meeting hall of the cage. As they all leapt through the trees, Naruto dropped back next to Kisame. He's here. Outside the building. On this path, we'll barely miss him. Kisame's sharp-toothed smile widened to nightmarish proportions as he veered off course to intercept a target he wanted to fight. The rest of Akatsuki continued onward to a fight that would lead to peace, destruction, or both. Sasuke leaned up against the tree, keeping a clear line of sight with the large building where the meeting was taking place. He had been told to not enter the building, as the last thing a peace negotiation needed was for the Hokage to find out that the hidden cloud's source was one of her own missing ninja. If Akatsuki attacked, the building would likely not be in mint condition for long. When the building began to explode, Sasuke would move in, and hope he wasn't too late to find a member of Akatsuki. Now that his eyes were fully healed, his basic Sharingan took next to no chakra to maintain, and it was only the fact that he had them active that he managed to notice the attack. He leapt to the side as the large shark made entirely of water crashed down on where he had been standing. Jumping higher up into the branches of the trees, Sasuke began to jump towards the cage summit building. Water style. Flying fish. Sasuke looked over his shoulder to see another watery fish flying behind him, slowly gaining ground. His hand lit up with a shriek of lightning, and he turned around midair to face the shark. Chidori mine. The ball of lightning simply stopped where it was, and exploded when the shark touched it. The water style fell to the ground like rain, and Sasuke whipped out his sword to block the incoming strike. He was swatted down to the ground as if his katana had been used to try and stop a building from crushing him, only it was even less effective. Sasuke crawled out of the crater in the snow he had made, and looked upon the strangest Akatsuki member he had seen, perhaps with the exception of Zetsu. He was a good 6 feet tall, and carried a sword covered in bandages that might have been as tall as he was. But the strange part was his blue skin, and the gills that seemed to be a part of his cheeks. Sasuke also noticed the Akatsuki cloak he wore, and he enviously noted that it was likely much warmer than his own cloak. You know, usually I'm the one killing my teammates, said the shark man, and Sasuke noted the pointed teeth. Now that you've killed Itachi, I get a chance to see what avenging a fallen comrade feels like. Care to help me experience that? Amaterasu. Sasuke did not feel like helping this Akatsuki member get revenge for the only living Uchiha's older brother. And he didn't waste any time as his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan spun to life and shot black flames as hot as the sun. The shark just brought up his sword like a large shield, and the black fire of Amaterasu hit the blade. Sasuke's Sharingan widened as the black fire that was able to burn for 7 days in a heavy downpour was simply sucked into the sword, which seemed to grow a bit larger. The swordsman grinned, and it was then that Sasuke realized that he was fighting another one of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Bloody Mist village. Years ago, he had had a run-in with Zabuza, and if it hadn't have been for Kakashi, he would have died then and there. Now he was fighting someone just as strong, if not stronger, alone. Samahata and I are in agreement. Your fire isn't nearly as strong as Itachi's, said the Akatsuki swordsman. But I guess that just means I can feel a bit nostalgic while I tear you to shreds. I'm Kisame Hoshigaki, and my blade and I are going to eat you alive. Sasuke brought up his sword, and blue lightning shrieked down the blade as he ran at Kisame. Fancy yourself a swordsman. Let me show you how wrong you are, shouted Kisame as he leapt to the challenge. Their swords clashed, but Sasuke was ready for Samahata's bulk this time, and his sword simply rolled away. Sasuke twirled his sword around, and sliced Kisame across the face as he continued past the legendary swordsman. Sasuke grinned as he turned to face the bleeding swordsman, but he was annoyed to see that his attack had only left a tiny scratch on the Akatsuki member's cheek. It would have been more effective, but Sasuke's Sharingan had noticed his opponent's sword eat the lightning chakra right off his own blade. The feeling was only annoyance though, which was infinitely superior to the burning pain that shot up his leg a second later. Looking down, Sasuke saw the mess that used to be the back of his calf. Unlike your pathetic excuse for a sword, Samahata only needs a moment of contact to cripple its prey, bragged Kisame, swinging Samahata over his shoulder confidently. Sasuke glared at the Akatsuki member, and the Sharingan in his left eye spun wildly. Kisame looked up in confusion as the sky became blood red, and the clouds began to move backwards across the sea of red. He looked down in pain and shock at his right hand, which still clutched Samahata as it fell to the ground. Kisame turned to look at Sasuke, who had moved without Kisame even seeing a blur as he cut off the legendary swordsman's hand. You might be the better swordsman, but this is my world now, said Sasuke as he stood up slowly. Kisame howled in pain as another sword impaled him from behind. Looking over his shoulder, Kisame saw another Sasuke clutching the sword behind him. Kisame felt a familiar presence crawling up his arm from where his hand had been cut off, and he closed his eyes, grunting as even more swords stabbed through him. Kisame opened his eyes just in time to swat Sasuke away with Samahata as the Uchiha leapt at him for the finishing blow. Breathing heavily, Kisame glared at the Uchiha. So sorry, but your genjutsu is nowhere near Itachi's level. It's plenty god, but my partner is always there to break me out of a nasty genjutsu. Sasuke took notice of Samahata's hilt, which had several blue spikes shooting out of it to pierce Kisame's hand. Injecting its chakra directly into Kisame had been enough to snap him out of the imperfect Tsukiyomi. Sasuke looked up to the building where the 5 Kage were meeting without any warning of the organization of terrorists that were heading there at the moment. He had to warn them somehow, and he could only think of a few attacks big enough to get their attention. So he used one of them as Kisame ran at him to avenge Itachi, which was still a strange concept to him. He had never really thought that his murdering brother could actually become close enough to someone that they would want to avenge him, though it made sense that if he did, it would be a fellow monster like Kisame. Samahata was brought down hard on Sasuke, but it was stopped by glowing purple ribs. They cracked a bit, but repaired themselves as Susanoo roared to life with an explosion of purple chakra. The blast sent Kisame hurtling back, and he skidded to a stop to look up at the towering spectral warrior. It had taken a good deal of training, and he was still unable to cloth his Susanoo in armor like Itachi's. Still, his Susanoo loosed an arrow at Kisame, who barely had time to bring up Samahata and deflect it. Even then, the arrow pierced the ground barely a foot from where Kisame stood. Good, it's only interesting when the prey fights back, said Kisame, a sick grin covering his face. Samahata's hilt bent like a snake and wound its way up Kisame's arm as it seemed to fuse with his skin. He held his hands up in a simple sign and reared his head back. Kisame's cheeks swelled to insane proportions before he opened his mouth and spat out a mind-staggering amount of water. Sasuke's Susanoo flailed uselessly in the watery dome as it was hit from all sides in quick succession. Kisame took a moment's pause to let Sasuke take in his new, even more shark-like form. Water style. Water prison shark dance. All that's left is to play with my food. The 5 Kage summit had burst into a small uproar at the Raikage's possession of the last free jinchuriki, and everyone present seemed insulted and furious, with the sole exception of the Raikage and his entourage. What right do you have to the 7 tails? Shouted the Tsuchikage, only raising his voice to be heard over the din. His question went unanswered in the general chaos of the moment however, and all the bodyguards present were tightening their grips on their weapons, ready to defend their leaders at a moment's notice. Enough. They were saved the trouble by Mifune, who had unsheathed his sword so quickly it created a large gust of wind. Before the bodyguards could react, the katana was resting once more in its sheath, and Mifune sat back down. Now, while you are in my land, this will be an orderly and peaceable summit. He turned to face the Raikage. Now, Lord Raikage, I will ask you what I'm sure we are all thinking. How did you come across the 7 tails jinchuriki? The Raikage sighed in relief at the subsidence of yelling. The jinchuriki was brought to our village after the destruction of her own by a wandering ninja, who had apparently set out to protect her from Akatsuki, and only arrived just in the nick of time. Tsunade's eyes widened as a ninja that fit the description jumped to the front of her mind, vowing to stop Akatsuki with or without the hidden leaf. Her suspicions and fears were confirmed when the Raikage answered the Kage's query. Who is this ninja? Sasuke Uchiha, said the Raikage calmly. Every ninja was aware of the last Uchiha, and the repercussions of one of the Hidden Leaf's founding clans potentially relocating to the Hidden Cloud. While one Uchiha wouldn't usually be a big deal, it became a big deal when the entire clan was comprised of one member. Kakashi in particular was rattled by his student's defection. It was clear that without Mifune's harsh gaze, the room would descend back into the clamor it had just left. In fact, no one could think of a way to voice an objection without making the problem worse. As the awkward silence dragged on for painful seconds, a messenger entered the room, bowing respectfully to Mifune. Sir, there is a large sphere of water and large purple man trapped within outside. Before anyone else could react, the Mizukage and her sole bodyguard were on their feet. The other bodyguards leapt into action at the swordsman's action, and the banners fell to the floor. Kisame Hoshigaki, said Chojuro, both terrified of fighting a living legend who had reportedly killed the previous Mizukage and impressed with himself for moving so quickly upon recognizing the threat. Tsunade was the next to speak up, standing up to be seen above Kakashi and Tenzo. I think we all know that Akatsuki somehow knows that we have the last jinchuriki, and they're coming for her, she said, gesturing to Fu, who was the only one still sitting in the balcony. Then the conversation was cut short as the roof exploded. Luckily, all the shrapnel had managed to hit all around Fu without even scratching the jinchuriki herself. The Tsuchikage looked up at the white birds hovering above the newly created opening in shock. Deidara. Just then, the doors burst pen, and a soul samurai ran in, followed by a triple-bladed scythe that flew through the air behind him. It came down to impale him, but was stopped by Mifune's blade, which defended his samurai and sent the weapon flying back. Damn it, I was going for a perfect record. Oh well. Kakuzu, how many did you get? Said Hidan as he caught his scythe out of midair and casually strolled into the room, along with the rest of Akatsuki. They weren't worth anything, so I left the killing to you. The big game is at the top, said Kakuzu as Naruto leapt down to join the other earthbound Akatsuki members. Konan and Deidara continued to hover above the meeting room. Orochimaru, shouted Tsunade angrily. Her attention was diverted however, when Tenzo stabbed Kakashi in the back. Tenzo, what are you doing? I guess the copy ninja isn't that great at spotting a copy, is he? Said Tenzo, as his skin slowly paled to a ghostly white. His brown hair also changed to a light green, and his clothes seemed to melt into an equally white skin. It's been a while since I've gone undercover for so long, but that wood-style user really boosted my strength. The world leaders watched, suddenly cautious of their own bodyguards, as Zetsu jumped back to the group of Akatsuki, where a completely black version of him rose out of the ground, and they fused together. Tsunade knelt down to heal Kakashi, and he was up in seconds, though he was clearly still injured. Battlefield trauma was her forte after all. The Kages stood by, ready to attack at a moment's notice, as Akatsuki parted to let a tall man with orange hair and numerous piercings walk forward. He fit the description of pain that Jiraiya had given, though Akatsuki's deference to him was a dead giveaway as to his status as Akatsuki's leader. Akatsuki will be taking the jinchuriki, he said matter-of-factly. The only question is, how much pain will you suffer before we do? The Raikage decided to try and swipe Pain's head off then and there, but he was stopped dead in his tracks and launched back the way he came just as quickly. A lot then. The Tsuchikage hadn't stuck around long after that. The oldest Kage had a score to settle, and sure enough, Deidara pursued him into the air. Once he had gotten high enough to ensure that he wouldn't accidentally vaporize the leaders of the world's most powerful countries by accident, he turned to face his wayward protege. You know, all those times I had hired Akatsuki, I honestly didn't know you had joined them. By the time I found out, Akatsuki had stopped taking jobs. What can I say? World domination requires a good deal of our attention, yeah, replied Deidara. She tossed out a small clay figure, and jumped off of her current bird as it flew towards the Tsuchikage. Deidara was enveloped in a cloud of smoke as the clay beast was trapped within a transparent cube. The white clay hawk tried to explode, but was atomized by Onoki's feared dust style. The floating man looked at Deidara's latest piece emerged from the smoke that had obscured it. A large clay serpent coiled around in the sky, suspended by large clay wings. Deidara stood atop the head of the long and skinny dragon with a smile on her face. Well, old man, is this a waste of time? The serpentine dragon flew through the air gracefully, dodging the cube that came threatened to vaporize it, and fired a smaller dragon out of its mouth as its tail grew shorter. The dragon flew at the Kage, who deftly flew out of the way. He was unprepared, however, when the dragon swooped around to follow him, even as Deidara launched another. Stuck between the two, Onoki stopped midair and slammed his hands together. The dragons exploded upon contact, but when the smoke cleared, the Kage was unharmed, covered by a smoking layer of solid rock. Deidara glared at the old man as his golem armor fell off. Her C2 dragon lost another segment of its tail as it pulled back its mighty wings. Small bits began to bulge from the clay creation, and they came flying out as a hail of clay insects when the dragon flapped its wings toward the Kage. Looking onward at the mass of exploding insects propelled toward him by a large gust of wind, Onoki's eyes narrowed as he clapped his hands together. When he opened them, he held a glowing rectangle between his hands that was incredibly thin. As he launched it forward, his dust style grew to enormous proportions and turned all of the miniature bombs into dust as they tried to pass through. It wasn't aerodynamic enough to cross the distance required to hit Deidara and end the fight though. I would have taught you the dust style, you know, he shouted across the gap to his former successor. Just as Mu taught it to me. You were to be the Kage after me. And then you betrayed my trust. Oh, shove it, yeah. My art is all I need. And it's 100, no, 1,000 times better than your pathetic dust style. Deidara lowered her hand into her clay pouch and began to chew on the white sculpting material as her dragon launched a particularly fat and fast dragon from its mouth. Such a shame to waste your potential, muttered the Kage, before raising his head to glare at Deidara. But I'll end it here. Lightened boulder technique. His weight decreased even further by the same technique that enabled him to fly. Onoki shot forward, faster than the smaller dragon could react. With his increased speed, he delivered a punch to send his former student hurtling to the ground below. However, Deidara's left hand came up and caught his wrist as his fist touched her abdomen. The renegade bomber, however, remained unmoved by his punch. Wow, you might hit fast, but you lose the force behind your punches too, yeah. It might not have been a big deal when you were young enough to still hit hard, but now you're just a feeble old man. The mouth on Deidara's right hand opened up and spat out a small bat, ready to explode. Reacting quickly, the Kage lowered his other hand to touch the massive dragon's head. Weighted boulder technique. Its weight increased several hundredfold. The massive clay dragon fell to the ground like a ton of bricks, leaving the bat to detonate uselessly several hundred feet above them. Her visible eye widening in shock, Deidara released the Kage and jumped off her falling creation at the last second. She knew the old man had to keep contact with the target, and quickly detonated the large dragon. The explosion large enough to damage the meeting hall, but if it meant killing the Kage, she didn't care. You know, replacing myself with a rock clone on such short notice like that is bad for my back. Deidara whirled around to see the Kage hovering behind her, one hand resting on his lower back. With a glare, the two resumed their exploding aerial dance, and Deidara wondered idly if she had at least destroyed the Kage's stupid hat. The fighting had been rather small scale in the beginning, as either side breaking out big attacks would result in friendly fire. In that regard, Deidara's dragon blowing up a good portion of the building was a blessing in disguise for both sides. It separated them all into smaller groups, where they could more safely use their better techniques. You remind me of the first leaf ninja I ever fought, said Kakuzu, glaring at the voluptuous Hokage in front of him. Well, let me show you what a competent leaf ninja can do to an enemy of her village, said Tsunade, cracking her neck. She was a bit surprised by the masked Akatsuki member's angry response to her words. You won't even hold a candle to his strength, he said angrily. I might even indulge in Hidan's favorite pastime here. I'm not sure I can resist the chance to end his entire clan. Wait, who is this ninja you fought? Asked Tsunade, ready to attack the moment he confirmed or denied her suspicions. Of course he wouldn't mention me, said Kakuzu, his voice dripping with spite and sarcasm. After I lost to the first Hokage, I was banished from my village. I stole the earth grudge fear before I left and exacted my revenge on those who had wronged me, but your grandfather, the man who ruined my life, was always too strong. So I'll have to settle for killing his useless excuse of a granddaughter. Tsunade roared in anger as she ran at Kakuzu, fist reared back to send him flying to the hidden sand village. To his credit, Kakuzu simply stood there as his skin darkened. The punch collided, and Kakuzu doubled over in pain as he felt several ribs break, gasping at the force of the blow. Perhaps Tsunade wasn't quite weaker than the first Hokage had been. Still, his earth spear technique absorbed most of the force, and he was conscious enough to have one of his hearts fire a blast of wind through his Akatsuki cloak to hit the fifth Hokage in the head. Tsunade was sent hurtling back by the blast, and the wind shredded her face. Kakuzu stood up, placing a hand on his wounded stomach, and looked for the now headless granddaughter of his most hated enemy. And Tsunade looked back, unchanged save for the tattoos spreading out across her body from the former location of the diamond mark on her forehead. I might not be my grandfather, and it's true that I can't use the wood style. But I am still the Hokage, and I refuse to be underestimated. Kakuzu decided to stop underestimating his foe as he discarded his damaged Akatsuki cloak. Grunting in pain as his 4 extra hearts tore their way out of his back, Kakuzu regained his composure once his back finished stitching itself back together. Very well then, he said gruffly through his mask. If you can heal, let's just see how much you can heal at a time. The mouths behind him opened with a loud crack and launched their powerful elements. Tsunade dropped her foot to kick up a wall of stone that used to be a part of the floor to block the attack, and it worked for a second. Then the overwhelming strength of the combined attacks tore the simple rock to pieces. When the blast died down, Kakuzu's eyes widened when he saw Tsunade running at him, flesh only halfway done healing itself. He ducked under the punch, but was given a kick in the face for his trouble. If it weren't for his skill in reattaching limbs, the fight would have been over right then and there. As it was, several threads shot out of his neck to catch his severed head and reattach it to his torso. Tsunade was having none of it, and grabbed the threads with both hands. Using Kakuzu like a mace, she swung his body around, nailing his fire heart. It was a testament to her strength that the blunt force trauma was enough to crush the heart behind the mask. Kakuzu's lightning, wind, and water hearts flew upwards to dodge the body-turned weapon. Firing a beam of lightning at the Hokage to get her to release Kakuzu proved incredibly ineffective. The first female Kage used Kakuzu's body as a shield, and his earth heart took the attack instead, getting destroyed in the process. She did let go of the body though, as the beam showed no signs of stopping. Granted, her drop kicking the wind heart was less than ideal, but by the time she had regained her footing on the shattered floor, Kakuzu's final 2 hearts had re-entered his body. If Kakuzu had been less prideful, he would have readily admitted his mistake in comparing the woman before him to her grandfather. He would fight, not a medic or a woman, but an S-ranked threat. Deciding then and there that he wouldn't let his emotions come into play from here on out, Kakuzu cracked his neck, which now connected his body and head. Kakuzu, the Akatsuki member with 5 hearts, said Tsunade, staring down the man she had just identified. You killed ninja under my command. I can't bring them back. I'm the best medic in the world, but even I'm not that good of a medic. But you'll find that the people best able to keep you out of the afterlife are the people best able to send you there as well. And if I have to kill you 5 times, well, that's just more therapy for me. Chojuro was quite proud of himself. Through all the chaos and explosions, he had managed to stay by the Mizukage's side. Maid Terumi had entrusted him with her safety, and he would be damned before he let her face a member of Akatsuki alone. Still, he had been hoping for an Akatsuki member with a little less terrifying reputation. As if sensing the boy's thoughts, Orochimaru's freakishly long tongue snuck its way out of his mouth and slowly licked his lips. Chojuro shuddered at the man's actions, and the three men on around him didn't fill the only legal member of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Hidden Mist with confidence either. He stopped shaking when he felt the Mizukage's reassuring hand on his shoulder. Chojuro, I can handle myself against this snake. You just handle his little worms. I know you can handle this. Chojuro gulped, but steeled himself for combat with the 2 stoic-looking ninja, and the 1 ninja who looked ready to kill for the legendary sword in Chojuro's hands. Kimimaro, Suigetsu, Jugo, said Orochimaru, addressing his 3 followers. You handle the guppy. I'll take care of the big fish. The white-haired one, apparently named Kimimaro, nodded silently. The massive orange-haired giant next to him seemed more resigned than eager to fight, but his lack of enthusiasm was countered by the shortest ninja's barely checked fervor. Chojuro was honestly surprised that this Suigetsu had contained himself this long. Chojuro was taken aback when Kimimaro removed his shirt, letting it fall around his waist. The reason became clear when a long, white sword rose out from under his skin. Chojuro's confidence actually swelled a bit before he realized what that meant. In a sword fight, he wouldn't be beaten by anyone. He was the current leader of the other non-existent members of the 7 swordsmen of the mist. Then he recalled where he had heard of these abilities before. The Kage revolt had been a rallying point for the 4th Mizukage's followers after he had adopted an anti-bloodline stance. While the event's political implications were terrible for the cause, Mei had agreed with the actions themselves. The warlike clan was dangerous, and far too bloodthirsty to operate in any civilized society. And now one of them that had somehow survived the eradication of the Kage clan was standing right in front of Chojuro, holding a sword made out of his own bone in his hand. Sighing in an attempt to calm his frantically beating heart, Chojuro pulsed his chakra through Haramakare and the bandages wrapped around the sword exploded off of the steel in a burst of chakra. Suigetsu's eyes lit up at sight of the sword, and despite the Kage's inherent advantage with his bloodline, only one to really seem eager about the fighting was the first to charge at Chojuro. In disbelief of the simple, idiotic attack, Chojuro swung his sword down, and the chakra emitted from the 2 holes at the tip of the massive sword took the form of an even more massive hammer. Chojuro saw the ninja in front of him turn into water right as the hammer crushed him into the floor. The bespectacled ninja was an experienced ninja from the Hidden Mist, and immediately identified the crushed person as a water clone and was immediately on guard. It saved his life, when he was able to block the small pellets that Kimimaro had launched at him from his fingertips. Changing the chakra around his sword into a massive fly swatter, he did one better than simply blocking the projectiles, sending them straight back. The 10 fingertip bones were stopped by a wall of water that rose up from the puddle that had been the water clone and absorbed the bullets of bone. The clone then reformed, wearing a fearsome grin with sharpened teeth. Opening his mouth, Suigetsu spit the bits of bone out. Which was something water clones couldn't do. Jumping away as Suigetsu smashed the ground where he had been standing with a strangely proportioned fist, Chojuro was forced to reevaluate his opponents. Kimimaro was clearly a Kage, which meant he had a unique control over his skeleton. It could supposedly harden to become stronger than the strongest armor, or form nearly indestructible weapons. If Suigetsu's ability was what Chojuro thought it was, he was the same little brother of Mangetsu Hazuka. Which meant that his older brother had been the previous owner of the same sword Chojuro now wielded. Fighting an opponent who could transform into water at will would be difficult, but he had a plan of sorts. The only unknown was the hulking orange-haired man who had remained silent until now. Kimimaro turned to his companion. He is skilled. If you do not fight, I might have to push myself too far to defeat him. Looking down at the last Kage, Jugo responded calmly. Then don't. He said simply. My devotion to Lord Orochimaru is absolute. I will win here, no matter the cost. And I cannot count on Suigetsu to watch my back. Can I count on you? Suigetsu was indeed doing a wretched job of watching Kimimaro's back, charging recklessly at Chojuro, reforming from the splatters of water whenever Chojuro cut him in half. Jugo sighed in resignation. Very well then, he said, as flaming red marks crawled across his skin, slowly covering his whole body. Whatever Jugo could do, Chojuro had a feeling he would find out soon. You know, it isn't nice to take advantage of our friendship like that. Kind of makes me mad. No, furious is the right word. And when I get furious, I just want to kill things. Grinning as his friend's bloodthirsty alternate personality slowly surfaced, Kimimaro pointed to Chojuro, who was still trying to keep his distance from the watery Hazuka who wanted his sword. Then kill him. A mad grin spread across Jugo's face as the red marks faded to a light gray. His eyes now a deranged-looking black and gold, Jugo began to laugh maniacally. I'm going to kill you. He shouted as he ran towards Chojuro, sped up by the chakra jets affixed to his back. Bringing up Haramakare to block the punch, Chojuro was nevertheless sent hurtling along the ground from the sheer power behind Jugo's hit. Skidding to a stop, he was barely able to get Haramakare in time to block Kimimaro's straight stab. The bone sword was impressive, and almost got through the hole in the legendary sword's tip to hit Chojuro. Twisting his sword to dislodge the bone blade from Kimimaro's hand, Chojuro kicked out to nail Suigetsu in midair. A bone sprung out of Kimimaro's other palm and he thrust it toward Chojuro's prone form. Suigetsu reformed and grabbed a hold of Chojuro's ankle, which was still stuck in Suigetsu's stomach. In his rage though, Jugo smashed down on Chojuro at that same moment. The explosion or debris and floor tiles was actually enough to send Chojuro through the floor to the level below. When the dust cleared, Chojuro stood, still shaking, holding a dented Haramakare above his head. Jugo, Kimimaro, and Suigetsu jumped down to surround him, and Chojuro hoped that Lady Mizukage was having better luck than he was. Orochimaru stood facing the Mizukage, who stared back unafraid. Sorry, but you're not really my type. A tad too old for my tastes, said Mei, a small grin tugging at her lips. Kukuku, laughed Orochimaru, as he licked his lips. I'm afraid you'll have to put up with me for a bit longer. Strength, chakra reserves, and 2 bloodlines, what more could I ask for in a body? Not waiting to see what the rogue Sannin was talking about, Mei began to run through hand seals. Water style. Hypercutter. Mei spit out a super concentrated stream of water that could cut through steel. Orochimaru dodged the blast of water by slithering along the ground on his stomach like the snakes he summoned. Cutting off her stream of water when it became clear that Orochimaru wasn't going to get hit so easily. The moment the water stopped, Orochimaru turned to slither towards the Mizukage. Hidden shadow snake hands. Orochimaru lifted his hand, and several large pythons shot out of his sleeves to wrap themselves around the Mizukage. The speed of the attack took her by surprise, though it made sense considering the former Leaf Ninja's legendary status. Orochimaru's legs reformed from the more snake-like blur as he came to a stop in front of her. Now then, your body is mine. Smirking seductively, the Mizukage breathed out a fine mist of acid. Orochimaru's skin began to melt off his body, and the same happened to the snakes wrapped around her. Jumping away from the Sannin, who was screaming in pain as his body melted, she grinned in victory. I'm sorry, I'm simply not into older men. She turned away to go help Chojuro with his own fight, but whirled around when Orochimaru's screaming turned to laughter. The mouth on the Akatsuki member's deformed face opened wide, and another body crawled out, without so much as a scratch. You won't be rid of me that easily. I won't take no for an answer. Your body will be mine. Lava release. Lava globs. Mei spat out several globules of lava at Orochimaru, who ran through his own hand seals. Wind style. Great breakthrough. The massive blast of wind that Orochimaru shot out of his palm was enough to turn the lava balls into minuscule bits of hot rock that cooled into a rain of pebbles by the time they landed around Orochimaru. Grinning insanely, the snake summoner launched another blast of blunt air at the Mizukage. It sent her flying back towards the wall. Twisting around mid-air, the Mizukage sprung off of the wall to shoot towards the pale-skinned Sannin. Water style. Water dragon bullet. Using her own velocity to make the water dragon even faster, the Mizukage's technique bore down on Orochimaru. A cloud of smoke enveloped him before the water could crash over the snake summoner. When the water collided with the Sannin and dispersed the smoke, Orochimaru had been replaced by a large purple snake. The snake opened its mouth to hiss at the Mizukage, and the rogue Sannin stepped out of the fanged reptile's mouth. You'll need to try harder than that if you want to beat me, or you could just give up. Kukuku. Chapter 22. Hello. Tamari swung her fan once more, chopping the snow-white Akatsuki member into tiny pieces with blades of wind sharp enough to cut steel. It was ultimately useless though, as more clones rose up from the ground, all of them wearing a completely ridiculous grin. Will you just stay dead? Shouted Tamari as she smashed a Zetsu clone upside the head with her war fan. Folded up, the wind-creating fan made an incredibly effective club, something Tamari used to great effect whenever a Zetsu clone got too close. Ebizo was holding his own against the horde of white, using a fishing pole of all things to keep the clones at bay. Oddly enough, the clones of Zetsu were treating it like a deadly weapon and keeping their distance. The ability to produce clones on this scale is an impressive ability, but I doubt it is enough to make him an S-rank ninja. Said Ebizo, as he wielded his fishing pole as a rapier to smack several Zetsu clones. Oddly enough, as soon as the flexible bit of wood hit them, the clones stopped whatever they were doing and stood completely still. It was the genjutsu touch that had made Ebizo feared during the war as one of the premier genjutsu experts in the world. One touch was enough to trap his opponent in a false world, often with no idea that they had been placed under a genjutsu. We need to be on guard for his true power. Tamari swung her fan, cutting down the entranced Zetsu clones like blades of grass, as she grunted in agreement. If he can do anything else, he certainly isn't in any hurry to do anything with it. True enough, ever since Zetsu had separated them from Gaara in the explosion, he had done little but send clones of himself en masse. As soon as she turned around to kill the clones that Ebizo had incapacitated though, a white Zetsu clone jumped out of the ground from behind her and wrapped large white spines around her. Tamari could feel her chakra being drained by the white Zetsu clone as she struggled to get away. Luckily, Ebizo noticed, and sent Zetsu stumbling away in a genjutsu-induced stupor. Thanks, said Tamari before returning the favor by smashing in a Zetsu's face over Ebizo's shoulder. This clone was different however, and exploded in a cloud of smoke. With all the Zetsu clones around, this was a debilitating problem. Luckily, one did not live over 80 years in the land of wind without learning some wind-style techniques. Wind-style. Smoke clearing. The particular technique Ebizo used was specifically designed to blow away smoke from smoke bombs. It wouldn't knock over a teacup, let alone harm an opponent, but it used up next to no chakra. Looking around frantically as he removed the cognitive functions of several Zetsu clones who had tried to get in close and looked around for Tamari, worried that she had been taken out while the smoke was up. Ebizo was surprised for a moment when he saw two copies of Tamari facing off against each other with the war fan stuck into the ground between them. For a moment he wondered how to tell which one was the real one, before his decades of experience with the chakra system kicked in automatically. Concentrating on the chakra system of the Kage's sister, Ebizo's eyes widened in shock. Impossible, your chakra, it's exactly the same. This news took Tamari off guard, though both copies reacted the exact same way. Damn it, you'll need to ask me something only the real me would know. Shouted both versions of Tamari in unison. Luckily for Ebizo, the other copies of Zetsu seemed to be content to watch the drama in front of them unfold, giving him time to concoct a plan to tell the real Tamari from the transformed Zetsu. Very well then, what was the name of your older brother? Asked Ebizo calmly. He noticed as one of the two copies of Tamari tightened her fists in anguish, but the other one turned to him in anger. My older brother was Konkuro. His death is the reason I want to get revenge on Akatsuki. The other copy of Tamari looked at Ebizo in horror as he slowly turned to her. Wait, Ebizo. They must have stolen that information with a spy, or something. She pleaded, holding up her hands as the elderly ninja whipped out his fishing pole. You have to believe me, he's the imposter. Ebizo brought up his fishing pole, prepared to send the obvious fake into a genjutsu. The fishing pole shot out to the side, the line flying out and digging into the other Tamari's neck. One sharp tug later, and the Tamari that had answered his question stumbled towards him in shock and received a sharp tap on the forehead to activate the genjutsu. You could never talk about a sibling's death so casually. Explained Ebizo calmly as the real Tamari regained her composure. If you were able to, I wouldn't want to fight alongside you anyway. Now then, we should clear this up and protect the Kage. Genjutsu. Field of Flames. Nothing seemed to happen for the second after Ebizo completed his hand seals, save for the Zetsu clones drawing closer now that their ploy had failed. Then they all collapsed on the ground, writhing in pain as their bodies were burned away by imaginary fires. Tamari retrieved her fan and drew a bloody thumb across the durable fabric. In a puff of smoke, a scythe-wielding weasel with an eye patch appeared alongside a glowing blue lantern. A swing of her war fan sent the weasel flying around the room, chopping the Zetsu army to pieces. Tamari was a bit winded by the chakra cost of summoning, which is why she hadn't used that technique at the beginning of the fight. However, anything was worth the cost if it meant protecting her younger brother. Well well well. Ebizo and Tamari looked up to the ceiling as a deep voice resounded through the chamber. It appears your little army ploy failed spectacularly. I guess I'll handle this. Fine, we'll do this the old-fashioned way. The two-toned man half-fused with the ceiling berated himself before shooting several wooden spikes out of the ceiling around him in an attempt to impale the sand ninja below him. Is Cage, I won't allow myself to lose again, said Gaara as he faced down the hunched-over Akatsuki member before him. The man's face was obscured by a thick bandana, but the voice was obviously distorted by something. I've heard it all before, he responded in a deep voice. The third said something similar before I killed him. And I imagine that your own father would have done the same if I had taken a more direct approach with him. As it was, the third Hokage got to him before my poison could do its job, but the end result was the same. Gaara's ringed eyes narrowed at the Akatsuki member's words. What interest do you have in the Cage? I am Sasori of the Red Sand, famed puppeteer of the village you now rule over. I am the killer of the third Cage, who has joined my collection. Sasori's hand slowly reached up to his mouth to uncover a demented segmented grin. The bits of the mouth moved separately, and the eerie clacking noise would have made anyone less stoic than Gaara shudder. And I had plans to add the fourth Cage to my collection. His foolish invasion of the hidden leaf saved me time, though I was lucky to get a hold of the body in time. Now you will be my third Cage. Gaara's sand moved instinctively to stop the barrage of Senbon that emerged from Sasori's mouth. The sand became so saturated with Senbon that by the end of the bombardment, the needles were bouncing off of themselves rather than being caught in the sand. One large pulse of the wall of sand sent the Senbon hurtling back at Sasori, albeit with a much lower standard of accuracy. The Akatsuki member simply stood there as the needles embedded themselves into his cloak. Sasori seemed to not notice his new resemblance to a pincushion, and Gaara was almost afraid of the answer for what he was about to ask. What is this collection? I am a puppeteer, said Sasori simply as he raised his left arm. The large cylinder detached itself from the rest of his arm and flew towards Gaara. Sand reached out to grab the projectile, and succeeded. The smaller cylinders embedded inside the large hand substitute shot out in a burst of pressure. It would have likely been difficult to dodge the canisters full of Senbon, but they were effectively contained by the Cage's sand. For your crimes against the village hidden in the sand, I, the fifth Cage, will be your executioner. With that said, Gaara's sand shot forward in a massive wave as the Cage rose his arms as if beckoning it forth. Sasori was many things, but puppeteers were not very mobile as a general rule of thumb, and there was no way he could simply dodge the enormous wave of sand even if he had placed more effort into the art of dodging. The tsunami of sand formed a large dome around Sasori, before compacting into a small ball around half the size. The sand fell away to reveal Sasori's body, which was surprisingly not a mangled ball of blood and bones. The bloodless body fell to the ground practically unscathed, yet still unmoving. Gaara was wary of any tricks, and his agitated sand whirled around him protectively. There was a blur of motion, and a cloaked figure emerged from inside the motionless Akatsuki member. Standing up, the figure cast of the cloak to reveal a young man with hair as red as Gaara's wearing an Akatsuki cloak. I suppose that technique could just as easily be turned against me. And now we can stop wasting time with meaningless trickery, he said as two scrolls fell into his hands from inside his sleeves. Holding one up in each hand, Sasori's real body slowly unrolled the two scrolls to reveal the numbers 3 and 4 written in kanji. There were two clouds of smoke that quickly cleared to reveal Sasori flanked by two robed figures. One had black hair, and the other had red hair cut short like both Gaara and Sasori. Gaara couldn't contain his shock as he recognized the two puppets. One he knew through association only. He had attended many meetings under the stony gaze of the third Kage's statue. It was surprising to see a puppet in the visage of the great leader of the hidden sand village, but the second puppet hit him much harder. While he had only been told about the exploits of the third Kage, he had been raised by the fourth Kage. Even if it was just a puppet, the resemblance was uncanny. You think you can unnerve me with these pathetic facsimiles? Your puppets have no chance against a true Kage. Sasori's laugh stopped Gaara from launching his sand to crush the Akatsuki's resident puppeteer in an explosion of blood. You think I've simply made copies of the previous Kage? They never recovered the third's body, and I think you'll find the fourth's body suspiciously missing. This the ultimate achievement of my art. Human puppets are much harder to create, but the rewards are well worth it. To make his point, the mouths of the two Kage snapped open as a compartment on their chests opened to pulse out waves of magnetism. A wave of Gaara's sand rushed out to meet the attack of the Akatsuki's puppets. Despite the amount of sand towering over all of the combatants, it was met grain for grain by a wave of golden sand. The amount was the same, though the greater weight of the gold allowed it to overwhelm the fifth Kage's sand tsunami. Black sand, 10-foot spikes. Gaara's sand reacted instinctively to the attack from above, and while it didn't stop the massive shapes made of iron sand, his ultimate defense did slow the third Kage's attack long enough for Gaara to jump out of the way. Gaara realized then that the puppets of his two predecessors still had access to their abilities, something that Kankuro had told him was impossible. Sasori brought his hand up in a unique seal to launch his next attack, determined not to give his latest target a moment's peace. Thousand-hand manipulation force. The third Kage raised his left arm and the sides opened menacingly to reveal the seal matrices inscribed on the insides. Near identical copies of the Kage's arm burst out of the seals, which in turn opened up to produce even more arms. Soon a wall of wooden hands was hurtling towards Gaara, who raised his sand to catch the attack. The hands wove around the sand, or attempted to anyway, as a blue-veined hand reached out and grabbed a hold of the arms. That didn't stop one of the hands from retracting into the arm to make an opening for a deadly purple mist to rain down on the Kage. His sand reacted quickly, but the poison was already around Gaara, who was holding his breath and sensing the world through his sand rather than risk opening his eyes. Not wanting to open his mouth and utter the name of the technique, Gaara simply sent his sand into a frenzied sandstorm to scour the poison from the air. Cables shot out of the mass of hands as it flew through the air, and wrapped themselves around his shield of sand. The third Kage popped off his arm at the elbow, detaching the mass of wooden hands. Sasori's hands snapped together in another unique seal that did nothing but command his puppets. Golden sand. Treasure drop. Gaara looked up at the massive sphere of golden sand that began to fall on top of him. Gaara's sand formed a thick dome over him, as he was currently held in place by his own sand, which refused to move to keep the cables from tightening around him. The golden dust weighed down on the sand dome, which held up admirably under the pressure. Gaara used the room around himself and the time his defenses bought to grind the floor beneath him to sand and escape. Still obscured from Sasori, Gaara sensed his sand cave in under the weight and velocity of the golden sphere and crush where he had been. Bursting from the ground in a flurry of sand, Gaara enveloped the two Kage puppets in coffins of sand. Crushing them did little to actually kill them, but it did freeze up all the joints of the puppets, turning them into useless hunks of wood, flesh, and metal. Sasori sighed heavily as his puppets failed to respond. I suppose this is what I get for letting my guard down. Give up now, Sasori, said Gaara, glaring at his village's pioneering puppeteer. He had no plans of sparing the murdering puppeteer, but if he stood still, Gaara would have a much easier time killing him. You're all out of puppets, and I've beaten your favorites. There are actually two puppets in my collection I adore more, though they're more sentimental than combat-oriented, said Sasori as he slowly unbuttoned his Akatsuki cloak, not turning to face the Kage who was glaring at his back. And the Kage weren't my best works. I don't make puppets, I make art. Art is eternal, and guess what? So am I. Sasori wheeled around, and concentrated jets of water shot out of his palms. Gaara's sand was barely fast enough to get between him and the attack, and his ultimate defense began to sag under its own weight as it took on water. The water gave up after a moment, and Gaara got a good look at the monster, for there was no more mistaking Sasori as human, before him. Sasori had looked unnaturally young, and now it made sense. He stood on a thick cable that emerged from where his stomach was supposed to be as blade-like wings fanned out behind him. The lines where his joints held him together were all too apparent without the Akatsuki cloak covering him up. Small gray tubes in his palms still dripped water, and Gaara could see two compartments in his chest, one adorned with the kanji for scorpion painted on in red. "So you see now?" asked Sasori mockingly. "Art is eternal beauty, and my greatest masterpiece is me." Fu had spent the first part of the fight in the meeting chamber trying not to be noticed. The moment the ceiling had exploded, she had taken to the skies in attempt to escape. She made it a fair distance from the chaos before she looked back. "Looks like my luck holds once more," she mused to herself. Looking away from the explosions and giant geometry lessons, Fu saw one thing she had no desire to see again hovering mere feet in front of her. Suspended by angelic wings of paper, Konan stared impassively as the jinchuriki backpedaled in midair. "You are needed to usher in an era of peace led by God himself. You can die in peace, knowing you brought about a greater good for all, or die in agony, knowing you failed to escape." Fu smirked victoriously. "How about I escape, laughing in the knowledge I gave you the slip?" Hiding in scale powder. A stream of blinding powder was propelled out of Fu's mouth, effectively blinding her opponent as the jinchuriki of the seven tails made her escape. There was a resounding explosion behind her, and the blinding dust was blasted away from where Konan had been. Fu put on a burst of speed to get further away from the battleground. She wasn't stupid though. Fu looked around frantically for the Akatsuki member, refusing to believe that she had blown herself up because Fu blinded her temporarily. Looking up, Fu barely had time to dodge the hail of paper shuriken. Every kid who had ever played ninja knew how to make paper shuriken, but Fu somehow knew that these would be far more lethal than their schoolyard counterparts. Konan swooped down at her target, more gracefully than Fu would like to admit, and made to envelop her with the paper wings. The seven tails had one thing going for it though, and that was speed and maneuverability. Fu's fats beating wings enabled her to avoid being trapped, and Fu realized that she wouldn't be able to simply get lucky and escape this time. Wincing as she drew on more of her tailed beast's chakra, Fu grew a long tail that whipped out to hit Konan in the face. Any doubts about where the explosion had come from faded when the section of Konan's face Fu had struck peeled off. Noticing the ceiling matrices inscribed on the notes, Fu desperately tried to get them off of her tail. It was in vain though, when the bombs went off anyway. To seal the deal, Konan sent a wave of paper shuriken into the smoke, only to hear them bounce off of some kind of armor harmlessly. The smoke cleared to reveal that Fu had become obscured by a thick blue armor, reminiscent of the beetle sealed inside her. It was one thing to draw on a tailed beast's chakra, but to cover your entire body in it was a burning experience comparable only to being burned alive forever. Fu had no illusions that she could keep up her armor indefinitely, but it was infinitely better than exploding. Konan glared at the jinchuriki who dared defy her. Exploding into paper slips as a long tail whipped through her, Konan transformed into hundreds of origami butterflies before reforming behind Fu. Raising her hand high, the paper around Konan ceased fluttering about and came together into a massive spear. The armor that encapsulated Fu wasn't weak, and the paper weapon glanced right off, even though Konan had hardened the paper to be stronger than steel. Still, they both knew that the armor was a temporary advantage. Once the beetle's carapace became too painful to hold up, Fu would be a sitting duck. Pushing her advantage, Fu charged Konan angrily. Konan gracefully dodged, and ducked under the tail that swiped past. She didn't see the tail reverse direction though, and was sent reeling by the blow that connected to the back of her head. Konan wheeled around to see Fu flit around, having ditched the armor for additional speed. Konan was smacked once more, and she gritted her teeth as she tried to track down any pattern to Fu's movements. Konan failed miserably as Fu smacked her around again and again. Each hit wasn't much more powerful than a punch from a genin, and it was clear that the jinchuriki was sacrificing power for speed and mobility. The blue-haired Akatsuki member burst into paper to avoid another blow, and was quick to reform away from where Fu continued to batter her paper clone. A large mass of chakra formed into a ring above her head, reminiscent of a halo, and was quickly launched at the jinchuriki. Fu noticed her mistake, and dodged out of the way. Even so, the chakram of paper left a nasty gash across the jinchuriki's chest. Demonic chakra bubbled around the wound and burned it shut, but the pain was evident on Fu's face. The pain was so intense that Fu apparently lost track of Konan's paper clone. Bumping into the clone, Fu panicked as it wrapped her in a tight grip of paper. The chakram meanwhile, turned around in the air and hurtled towards the seized jinchuriki. While the technique could have easily cut her in half, a wound not even a jinchuriki could recover from, pain would kill Konan, childhood friend or not, if she delayed the plan for 7 years when it had just entered its final stages. So instead, the paper weapon fell apart as it got closer and helped restrain the jinchuriki. Konan made a single seal to activate the seals on the tags used to make the chakram. Archaic writing crisscrossed the paper mummy in seconds, sealing it from anything less powerful than a tailed beast ball. The paper floated to Konan, who began the long trek back to the leader of Akatsuki. She hadn't noticed at the time, but the jinchuriki had managed to place quite some distance between Akatsuki and herself. Storm style. Laser circus. Multiple beams of light flew out of Darui's hands toward their target. The lasers could travel at incredible speed, change direction as they read Darui's will, and had a near-limitless range. All in all, they were the epitome of skill. Naruto smirked as he decided to show Darui the difference between the two of them. Skill was one thing, but Akatsuki specialized in fighting tailed beasts, a task that required overwhelming power. Sage art. Gale force. The lasers faltered in the face of the powerful winds that tore up pieces of the floor. Even the strongest of the lasers faded to nothingness several feet from the blonde Akatsuki member. Unfortunately for Naruto, there was one other ninja present who dealt in overwhelming force. Lariat. Naruto sensed the movement of the fourth Raikage, and he would have had to have deaf to miss the shouting. But the Raikage's lightning armor increased speed as well as attack and defensive strength. Naruto ducked, but was unable to fully avoid the attack, and the Raikage's metal vambraces grazed his forehead. Granted, a grazing blow was still enough to send the sage flying across the room. Naruto skidded to a stop, but looked up just in time to see the Raikage's fist hurtling towards his face. Perhaps mentioning his hand in the ceiling of Killer Bee had been a bad idea. The blow connected, but Naruto was slightly ready for it, and enacted his own counterattack in the moment when the Raikage was standing still. Grabbing onto the edge of the Raikage's vambrace with one hand, Naruto pulled himself forward, delivering his own punch to the Raikage's face. The muscle-bound cage was sent soaring towards his bodyguard. Naruto jumped into the air, intent on trying to end it there, but Darui fulfilled his role as the Raikage's protector. Water style. Tidal drive. The burst of water from Darui's mouth was strong enough to stop Naruto's forward momentum, but the stalwart sage bore the brunt of the attack easily as the Raikage rose to his feet. Calmly placing one hand into the water, the Raikage sent a massive shock through the water towards Naruto. The Akatsuki member released the grip his chakra had on the ground, allowing the water to push him away from the charged current. He hit the wall hard, but Naruto barely felt it through Sage mode, instead flipping up the wall before the lightning could electrocute him. The Raikage barely missed Naruto as he punched at the Akatsuki member and smashed the wall where he had been into 1,000 little pieces. Naruto detached from the wall, using gravity add force to his attack. Running through several seals as quickly as he could as the Raikage attempted to remove his hand from the wall, Naruto gathered wind chakra around his fist, hoping to use the element's advantage against lightning to break through the powerful lightning armor that empowered the Raikage. Sage art. Whirlwind fist. It was a testament to the defensive aspect of the lightning armor that a Sage Mode-powered technique with an elemental advantage didn't punch all the way through the Raikage's chest. As it was, the wound was nothing to scoff at, and Naruto's hand was covered in blood when he was knocked away by Darui's laser circus. "Lord Raikage, are you okay?" asked Darui in concern as the Raikage returned to his bodyguard's side to regroup. "I'm fine," replied the Raikage, as he cauterized his own wound with a handful of lightning. He glared at Naruto's, who was catching his breath and trying not to rub at the bruises forming all over his body. Naruto was certain that if he could survive this last raid and Akatsuki captured the last jinchuriki, he would be in the clear. Unfortunately, survival was still up in the air. Any last words before I offer you two to Jashin? Asked Hidan amicably. He thought he was being a pretty nice guy, letting them get in some last words before they were sacrificed to his god. Hidan didn't think he had been rude enough to justify getting punched into the wall by a rock golem. That fucking hurt, you fat bastard. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Oh, shut up, will you? Lava style. Fiery quicklime. Kurotsuchi spat out a blob of gray quicklime that landed on top of Hidan, who began to shout as the hot substance began to burn him. That burns, bitch. I'll fucking sacrifice you for that. He scraped the substance off of his skin with the blade of his scythe, a method that wound up removing a fair bit of his skin as well, and then swung his scythe experimentally to see if his arms still worked. Grinning maniacally, Hidan threw his scythe at the Tsuchikage's bodyguards, guiding it through the air with the cable that ran from the scythe into the sleeve of his Akatsuki cloak. A small black cylinder fell into his other hand, and a flick of his wrist extended the weapon into a long spike. Armed for close-range combat, Hidan ran towards the two hidden rock ninja who were busy dealing with his scythe's random movements. The giant rock golem that the fat one had created swung its hand down to swat Hidan, who deftly jumped over it. Stabbing the golem in the wrist several times did little to slow it down, but Hidan was able to dodge the next slap, which instead took off the rock monster's other hand. Grabbing onto the golem's head, Hidan leaned back hard. The momentum was enough to separate the golem's head from its body, but only once it stupidly added force to Hidan's attempt by punching him. Hidan shouted in glee as the pain spread throughout his body, and the force of the monster's punch took off its own head as it crumbled to dust. It would have been an acceptable loss if Hidan died like a normal person. Akatsuki caught the scythe as it swung downwards at him between two massive mitts of stone that coated his hands, but the three-sharp blade pierced through the stone and nicked his hands anyway. Hidan pulled his scythe back, taking a nice taste of the tiny amount of blood on his scythe's longest blade while his two opponents watched on in curiosity mixed with disgust. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff Jashin wants. I suppose that little cut doesn't hurt much, but now that the ritual has begun, we can experience the ultimate pain together. Shouted Hidan as his feet used the blood dripping from his wounds to create the symbol of his religion on the ground. Too late, Kurotsuchi realized that it was a bad idea to let the zealot of Akatsuki do as he pleased. Instead of both sides catching their breath for a second while Hidan ranted, the Akatsuki member was preparing something. I don't know what you're doing, but I'm going to end this. Shouted Kurotsuchi as Hidan's skin became jet black, save for the bone-like markings across his skin. Lava style. Burning uppercut. Just die already. The female spat a globule of lava onto her fist, which remained unburned thanks to some clever manipulation of her own bloodline's chakra. Now, the ritual is complete. All that's left to do is the fucking hell bitch. Shouted Hidan as Kurotsuchi's flaming fist connected with his chin. The blow was a complete surprise, mostly because Hidan had his eyes closed as he prayed to his god. Glaring at the girl, who was very surprised that Hidan was still alive let alone conscious, he slashed at her with his black spike. It dealt a painful blow to her gut, and out of instinct Kurotsuchi grabbed a hold of it before Hidan punched her away. She had a rather impressive grip on the spike that was lodged in her abdomen, and pulled it away with her when Hidan punched her in the face. She looked around for Akatsuki, wondering why he was standing around when their opponent had her injured so badly. She also wondered why Hidan was just standing in his blood circle raving like a madman. She finally found Akatsuki, barely conscious with third-degree burns all over his chin. I'll get to you later for daring to interrupt a sacred ritual of Jashin, shouted Hidan irritably. Now where was I? Oh yeah. Die fucker. With a rather unceremonious end to his ceremony, Hidan raised his scythe up, bringing it down awkwardly to stab himself through the chest with all three blades. Akatsuki convulsed in pain as blood practically exploded out of him. In sharp contrast to Akatsuki's dying look of anguish, Hidan's face was one of pure bliss. That feels fucking good, he moaned out as the markings across his body faded to reveal the blood-covered skin. Kurotsuchi was scared. She had agreed to be one of her grandfather's bodyguards, assuming that no one would dare attack a meeting of the most powerful ninja in the world, and even when Akatsuki did blow down the front door, she had only thought about showing off her strength. Losing had never crossed her mind. Now losing was looking like the only outcome. Hidan grunted as he pulled the scythe out of his chest, wiping the blood off of it with his Akatsuki cloak. Now then, I'm going to make this one hurt. After all, I have all the time in the world to make you pay for interrupting my ritual. Kurotsuchi tried to back away from the approaching monster, but the spike still embedded in her chest prevented her from moving. Hidan twirled his scythe before dropping the tip into the small pool of blood that had escaped her wound. As Hidan turned to walk back to his ritual circle, his skin became black and white once more. Hidan turned back around to face his victim once he was in position, pulling out another spike to enact his ritual. Now then bitch, a quick death is too good for someone who dare interrupt Jashin's ritual. What should I do to you? Hidan smiled sadistically as a brilliant idea came to him. It had been a while since he had been able to take his time with a sacrifice, what with his money-grubbing partner always telling him to hurry up. Let's break you mentally first. Let me hear those fucking screams. Genjutsu. Jashin's vision. Hidan's genjutsu was peculiar in that it was completely unbreakable and could not be avoided by any means. The only downside was that it could only be cast on the user, and was a mental torture like no other that would not stop until it had ran its course. The very reasons that had made it useless and forbidden in the hidden hot springs village were what made it perfect for Hidan's line of work. Jashin's ritual didn't just link the flesh, but the mind as well. Any kind of pain was a delicacy to Jashin and his servants, and mental anguish could be used without killing the sacrifice too soon. Hidan's vision turned red as he found himself suspended on a metal rack floating above a sea of fire in a rain of blood, held down by dozens of spikes impaled through his limbs. A grin found its way to his face, knowing that the little girl from the hidden rock village would be experiencing the exact same genjutsu he was. The only difference was that he enjoyed every second of it. A demon's bellow rang out through the genjutsu, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A massive pillar of fire erupted from the lake of flames below and engulfed the entire apparatus holding Hidan down. The flames died down and Hidan was ran through with a massive scythe, wielded by a shadowy figure composed entirely of pain and suffering and blood. While Hidan knew that his genjutsu world's approximation of Jashin was nowhere close to the real deal, it was close enough for the purposes of the genjutsu. The god of pain seemed to flow down his scythe, traveling into Hidan's body and filling it beyond the brim with indescribable pain. Accustomed to the pain though he was, Hidan couldn't stop convulsing as he screamed in ecstasy. In the real world, Hidan lay on the ground writhing in equal parts pain and pleasure, laughing all the while. Several yards away, Kurotsuchi writhing in pain and horror, screaming. Hidan hadn't actually used this genjutsu since being paired up with Kakuzu, who would have just complained that 10 minutes to not even kill a victim was just a waste of time. Chapter 23. Kakashi's hands sparked with a loud chirping sound as he punched his way out of the rocky prison that he had been trapped in during the explosion. The prison had been draining his chakra at an alarming rate, and he wasn't about to lose any more than he had to. Looking around the room with his Sharingan, Kakashi quickly identified his opponents as some of Orochimaru's followers. While he was glad that he wasn't fighting a member of Akatsuki one-on-one, 4-on-1 weren't much better odds, even if they were weaker opponents. Hey fatass, that didn't work, taunted the only female of the group, poking a rather rotund individual with his hands on the dome of rock that had trapped Kakashi. Tayuya, a girl shouldn't talk that way. Tayuya smacked the orange-haired man on his head with a thin piece of metal, which upon further inspection was a flute. Bite me, fatso. said to Yuya, drawing out the last word mockingly. The larger man grit his teeth, but otherwise remained silent. Oi, let's get down to business and end this quickly, otherwise Kimimaro and Lord Orochimaru will never let us live this down, said the apparent leader of the group, a blue-haired man with what appeared to be a second, limp head coming out of the back of his neck. Let's finish this piece of trash by the book. He jumped back, along with the red-headed female and the six-armed member of the squad. Biting down on his thumb, he ran through the seals for a summoning. Kakashi's Sharingan eye widened as he ran forward to try and stop the leader of the group from summoning an ally. The fatter member of the four-man squad slammed his hands on the ground in an attempt to stop Kakashi from interfering. Earth style. Earth shore return. A large rectangle of rock rose up between Kakashi and his targets, and he performed his own seals on the run to break through the defensive barrier of stone. Lightning blade. The blue lightning in his hand tore through the lower-leveled earth style like it wasn't even there, and Kakashi continued onwards to attack the three that had jumped away from the front lines. He stopped mid-air as the large man below reached up with surprising speed and grabbed hold of his ankle, swinging him around with a loud shout like a ragdoll. This way! Shouted out the leader, and his comrade was eager to comply, throwing Kakashi towards the other three before the leaf ninja could free himself with his lightning blade. Summoning Rashomon. Slamming his hands on the ground to complete the technique, he summoned a large red gate that rose out of the ground behind him, raising the other two members of his squad high into the air of the cavernous room they were fighting in. Kakashi's hand thrust the lightning forward towards the leader of the group, intent on taking him out immediately. The smart thing to do would have been to retreat to the top of the wall, but Orochimaru's underling actually ran towards the hidden leaf Jonin, rearing back his own fist for a punch. Their fists passed, each traveling towards the other's face at great speeds. Until Kakashi's stopped dead in its tracks. His Sharingan had seen the counter of course, but it had been so unexpected, he simply hadn't reacted in time to avoid it. In his defense, it was perfectly reasonable that Kakashi would be surprised by another hand emerging from halfway up the man's arm to grab his wrist. The Sound Force leader brought back his other fist and it connected cleanly with Kakashi's face, twice from the feel of it. Kakashi was sent flying backwards, and he skidded to a stop just in time for the world to fade to black as a sound reached his ears. Suddenly, chains bound him, arresting his movements. Scoffing at the obvious genjutsu that had been easy to detect even without the Sharingan allowing him to see it traveling through the sound waves, Kakashi broke it with hardly a second thought. He ducked underneath a golden boomerang, and then jumped to the side as several more dug into the ground where he had just been standing. Jesus Kidomaru, you really are useless, berated to Yuya, addressing the six-armed Spider-Man who was in the process of spitting out more golden web to shape into weapons. Well, screw you too, he retorted short-temperedly. At least he noticed my attack. Did you even cast a genjutsu there? Yuya was about to respond when the leader of the group spoke up. This is Kakashi of the Sharingan, of course he didn't bother with a low-leveled genjutsu like that. Bring out your Doki to help me and Jirobo deal with him. Kidomaru, you take any openings you find to turn him into a pincushion. Okay Sakin. No need to tell me twice. Shame the game is gonna end so soon though. Kidomaru lamented. Kakashi was almost dumbstruck by their appalling lack of teamwork. That soon changed to appreciation of their teamwork in the face of such hatred and animosity towards each other when they went on the offensive. The four covered each other almost perfectly. Sakin's lightning-quick style that utilized his unique ability to grow more limbs whenever and wherever he felt like was complemented by the slow and powerful style Jirobo utilized. Any openings for Kakashi to go on the attack were immediately closed by golden projectiles courtesy of Kidomaru. Wary of any more genjutsu when he heard the sound of the flute start up again, Kakashi was just downright surprised again by the three large ogres that came at him swinging wildly with clubs, claws, and one using its body as a large battering ram. That answered his question about what the Doki were, and would have overwhelmed any lesser ninja with sheer ferocity and numbers. Kakashi was an elite of the Hidden Leaf Village though, and what the ogres had in raw power, they lacked in skill. In addition, their wild attacks had forced Jirobo and Sakin to back off a bit, lest they be struck down by the massive creatures in the crossfire. Given what he had observed, Kakashi didn't think anyone would really care about their comrades' well-being. Dodging the haphazard attacks was made even easier by the Sharingan, and he formulated an insane plan to regain momentum in this fight. Jumping on top of the monster's club as it crashed down on the ground next to him, Kakashi jumped up onto the large metal weapon. Reacting as anyone who didn't spend a lot of time studying taijutsu would be expected to, the ogre flung its weapon upwards in an attempt to fling Kakashi off. On one hand, this should have never worked, as Kakashi could have easily fixed himself to the club with chakra. On the other hand, Kakashi didn't want to waste his time fighting mindless summons when he could use such a base reaction to take the fight to the one who was controlling the monsters. The Sound 4 had no idea what to think as Kakashi went flying through the air as if he had been launched by a catapult, which he kind of had been. Blue lightning raced down his arm as he flew towards the top of the giant red gate, and more specifically the person engrossed in playing her flute. Kidomaru threw the golden kunai he had crafted, but they were swatted away with ease by the epitome of lightning-style techniques. The piercing chirp of the lightning blade was enough to cut through the sound of her flute, and Tayuya looked up just in time to panic. To Tayuya's credit, she managed to raise her flute up as some kind of last resort defense. It was made of a sturdy metal, capable of deflecting kunai and shuriken with ease, but the musical weapon stood no chance at all against the technique that got its name by cutting a bolt of actual lightning down the middle. The flute, coupled with a far too late attempt at dodging, did redirect the attack though. Kakashi's aim had been a little hit or miss to begin with, what with his insane tactic to get close enough to use his best technique, and he had no way at all to alter his course while in the air. So instead of running his arm cleanly through the redhead's chest, Kakashi settled for slicing her right arm from her body in an explosion of blood. Crying out in pain, Tayuya fell backwards off of the massive Rashomon gate clutching her shoulder, which was bleeding heavily from the new opening created by the lightning blade. The next step of Kakashi's plan was to deal with the spider lurking up here as well, but before he could turn around, three fists impacted Kakashi's back, one hitting the spot where Zetsu had stabbed him. The fake Yamato's attack had been healed by Tsunade, but both of them had known it was a rush job. Cringing in pain, Kakashi blindly whipped his lightning blade around, forcing Kidomaru to vacate the top of the Rashomon gate. Well, there goes the black mage, said Kidomaru, not sounding remorseful about his comrade's defeat as he should have. Looks like this boss is tough. Anyone got any phoenix feathers? Shut up, said Sakin tersely. It appears we need to step up our game. I really didn't want to use the curse seal against trash like this, but it looks like we have no choice. Kakashi was not pleased by the idea of cursed seals. Anything sealed was usually handy in a fight, and cursed things were usually powerful, even if the drawbacks weren't good. Dark marks began to spread across the skin of the remaining three members of the Sound 4, and unbeknownst to them all, Tayuya's mark subconsciously activated to keep her alive through the shock of losing an arm. The actual marks varied from spots akin to droplets of water to vine-like markings and lines of arrows. Kakashi's Sharingan wasn't as skilled as the Byakugan at seeing chakra, but he could easily sense the dark and oppressive chakra pulsating through the marks. Man, these cheat codes feel amazing as always, said Kidomaru, flexing his muscles appreciatively. Kakashi was more than happy to let them revel in their own strength while he nursed his reopened wound. It was nowhere near as life-threatening as it had been when Zetsu had first stabbed him, but if he had to fight while injured to that extent, it might as well be. It will be a pain to take a break instead of helping Lord Orochimaru once we finish wiping the floor with this piece of trash. And he won't be happy to know that we lost Tayuya, said Jirobo, actually shocking Kakashi with how much he cared. Granted, Kakashi had been expecting all three of them to bury each other alive and dance on the graves if given the opportunity, so his expectations for teamwork were at a record low. The black cursed seals spread the rest of the way across the remaining three's skin, turning it into an ashen gray. Their appearances altered drastically as well, until each resembled a unique demon. Sakin looked like a demon right out of a children's fairy tale, complete with blood-red skin and a single horn jutting out of his head. Jirobo looked even more ogre-like than before, with bumpy red skin and a wild mane of orange hair instead of the tiny amount on an otherwise bald head he had before transforming. Kidomaru's black hair had become a light gray, and his skin had turned red as well. There were two horns on either side of his head, much smaller than Sakin's larger one, and a third eye located between them on his forehead. Sakin reached up with a red hand and tapped the mop of hair emerging from the back of his neck. Time to wake up, bro, he said, wearing a grin that wouldn't look out of place on a serial killer. We've got to take out the trash. To Kakashi's apparently never-ending surprise, the mass of hair straightened up, and spun around to reveal a face identical to Sakin's. Looking around for a moment, the second head sighed heavily, before stepping out of Sakin's body with another identical one. I suppose it won't do to have the Sound 4 win with only 3 members. Just wouldn't make sense. The side that he had exited on changed on Sakin, becoming spiky gray armor akin to a dragon's hide. Thanks Ukin, said Jirobo, always proving himself the most polite of the group. Despite the ogre's appearance, he seemed calmer than before if anything else. Fuck off, I was enjoying my nap, thank you very much, replied Ukin irritably. Jirobo grit his teeth angrily, clenching his fists in an attempt to restrain his anger. Roaring in fury, the largest member of the Sound 4 charged at Kakashi recklessly. I'm going to crush you before I crush everything else here. You're dead. Kakashi took back what he said about being the calmest member of the quartet. Arhat fist. Jirobo charged recklessly, swinging wildly. Kakashi easily sidestepped the telegraphed blows, but the sheer force threatened to pull him around with the wind generated by each swing. Drawing a kunai, Kakashi went to incapacitate the red giant, but he was forced to jump back when a golden arrow half as big as he was threatened to take off his arm. Looking up, he saw Kidomaru suspended in a web, holding a giant golden bow, strung with spider silk. Damn, I missed. Guess I need to raise my accuracy skill some more, he murmured to himself as he prepared another arrow. Kakashi's Sharingan followed the arrow as it tore through the air, and allowed him to read the otherwise imperceptible change in course as it almost read his effort to avoid it. Luckily, Kakashi noticed the arrow's adjustment with his Sharingan and stopped as the arrow smashed into the ground he had almost been standing on. Kakashi ducked under twin blows from the 2 identical demons that came at him from either side. The brothers grabbed a hold of each other's hand, using it to pull themselves in for a dual kick that would have likely pounded Kakashi into unconsciousness if it had connected. Falling backwards had saved him, and in a feat of dexterity, Kakashi straightened up and drove his kunai through the 2 hands. Kakashi jumped back to dodge Jirobo's enraged punch. The raging berserker either didn't see or didn't care about the 2 comrades stuck to each other in his way. A powerful punch caught on their forcibly joined hands and pulled the leaders of the Sound 4 to the ground in an explosion of dust. Kakashi flew through hand seals as he flew backwards, preparing his chakra to take out Orochimaru's underlings. Fire style. Fireball technique. The flames shot out of his mouth, ignoring the mask in the way, and engulfed the 3 members of the Sound 4. Kakashi was still in midair though, and had no way of avoiding the golden arrow that came tearing through the fireball, intent on running him through. Luckily, the fireball burned up the guide thread attached to the back of the arrow, and Kidomaru couldn't aim properly in the first place with his vision obscured by raging flames. The arrow still tore through Kakashi's right shoulder, effectively rendering the limb useless. Still, with the others out of the way, Kakashi was confident he could take the archer out one-on-one, even wounded as grievously as he was. Unfortunately, Kakashi had underestimated the resilience granted by the Cursed Seal's second stage. Jirobo decided to correct his misconception by coming at him in a fit of rage, barely aware of the world around him, intent only on ending Kakashi's life. Kakashi skidded to a stop and ran towards the Red Ogre, good hand holding a chirping ball of lightning. Time seemed to slow as the 2 were about to clash, Jirobo with his fist held high and Kakashi coming in low with a lightning blade clutched in his left hand. The speed that Kakashi had honed throughout his career as an elite ninja of the Hidden Leaf was too great for the slow but powerful Jirobo to handle though, and he stopped dead in his tracks as Kakashi's hand erupted out of his back in a spray of blood. Kakashi looked over the dying man's shoulder as his curse mark faded to see Kidomaru launch another arrow at him. Waiting until the last second, Kakashi used Jirobo's body to manipulate the trajectory of the projectile while it was still inside the fat corpse and the golden arrow barely grazed him, leaving a small cut on his side. Casting the dead man down, Kakashi evaluated his remaining 3 opponents. Kidomaru was busy chewing the webbing for his next arrow, mumbling to himself about ballistic trajectory and the effects of any drafts in the area. Sakin and Ukin had rejoined in order to increase the rate at which they healed from the burns across their bodies, but Kakashi didn't know why they had rejoined, he just observed that they had. Facing down Sakin and his brother would be difficult enough without having to deal with the spider archer taking potshots at him during the fight, and dealing with the twins' extra limbs would be difficult without the use of his right hand anyway. Realizing he had little choice if he wanted to get out of here alive, Kakashi began to focus a large amount of chakra into his Sharingan. The red and black eye spun wildly as it morphed into a three-bladed pinwheel. Kidomaru was the target of Kakashi's reality warping Kamui, and the archer's webs worked against him for once. While he didn't stick to his own webs, he had voluntarily wrapped his arms up to reduce the recoil of firing his massive weapon and brace himself. Now, by the time he noticed what Kakashi was doing, he didn't have time to unravel himself before the hole in reality opened, sucking him into another dimension with a painful-sounding scream. Blood began to seep out of Kakashi's Mangekyo Sharingan and over his mask as he fell to one knee in chakra exhaustion. A foot connected painfully with his face as his Sharingan returned to normal. "You worthless piece of trash!" shouted Sakin in a furious rage as he kicked the exhausted Kakashi around. The Hokage's bodyguard was too tired to even think about moving, and Sakin exploited it, reveling in his opponent's weakness. "Now I'm the only one on his team left. I'm the leader of absolutely nothing." Kakashi somehow found the strength for a bit of sarcasm in him. "Not that you were really leading them anyway. I've seen better teamwork from a group of freshly minted genin from different villages." Sakin's face contorted in anger as he delivered another kick to Kakashi's stomach. Stepping maliciously on Kakashi's wounded shoulder to elicit a gasp of pain, Sakin pulled out a kunai for the finishing blow. "Any last words?" he asked wrathfully. Kakashi grinned, though the expression was hidden by his mask. "Yeah, I win," he said simply. Sakin had time to look confused before Kakashi's shadow clone burst out of the ground beneath them. Grabbing a hold of Ukin's head with both hands, it converted its entire being into lightning chakra. The two demon twins screamed in agony as the lightning fried Ukin and shocked his joined brother into unconsciousness. The clone disappeared in a cloud of smoke, and Sakin and Ukin collapsed on the ground next to Kakashi. The elite ninja of the Hidden Leaf village looked down at his mangled shoulder, and could feel the reopened wound Zetsu had given him in his back. He had lost a lot of blood and chakra in the fight, and he wasn't going to be much good to anyone except perhaps as a hostage anytime soon. Still, he had managed to defeat Orochimaru's elite bodyguards by his lonesome, and he thought that deserved some credit. As the host of this event, I will be your opponent. It is only fair that the two leaders should clash, said Mifune as he stared down Pain. The orange-haired god simply looked at the old samurai as one would a misguided child. I suppose no harm could come of letting you entertain me until Konan captures the seven tails, the pierced man said condescendingly. Mifune decided to cut their banter short by unsheathing his katana rapidly. The quick application of chakra sent a blade of chakra hurtling towards Pain that didn't cover half the distance between them before Mifune had sheathed his blade. Pain's rippled eyes narrowed dangerously, and the chakra wave dispersed harmlessly against an invisible barrier. A jet black rod emerged from the sleeve of Pain's Akatsuki cloak to block the blow that came immediately afterwards. The samurai leader struggled to break through the simple rod, but was blasted away after a few seconds. Looking at Pain, the leader of Akatsuki didn't seem to have exerted himself at all. It appears that you won't be as entertaining as I had hoped. I'll end this quickly, said Pain as he raised his hand. Mifune tightened his grip on the hilt of his sheathed sword, ready for any kind of attack. He suddenly felt a powerful force pull him across the conference room towards Pain's outstretched hand. Pain raised the black rod in his other hand to impale Mifune, and the rod extended to a length much longer than the sleeve it had emerged from. Mifune drew his sword, catching the tip of the rod with the edge of his sword. The blow deflected the rod's attempt to run him through, and Mifune came extremely close to crashing into Pain as a result of the powerful pull. As it was, the deflection caused Mifune to pass Pain on the right, missing a collision by several inches. He twisted the katana in his hands expertly, almost cutting off Pain's arm. A twist of Pain's wrist caused the long black rod to snap easily, and Akatsuki's leader spun it around to block Mifune's strike. The samurai jumped back as he sensed the impending attack. There were no obvious cues that Pain was about to blast him with the force of a small mountain, but the old samurai's honed battle sense could detect something. Either way, the distance was not nearly enough, as Pain's attack sent him skidding across the room regardless. Perhaps you can provide me some small measure of entertainment after all, said Pain, looking at Mifune appreciatively. Though you will be no match for a god such as myself. Mifune sheathed his sword, preparing his most devastating attack. I'll end this with my best attack. Final draw. Mifune channeled a large amount of chakra into the scabbard of his katana, releasing it all with a quick draw and slice of his katana, sheathing the weapon before the blast of cutting chakra had gone even 1 foot. The blast of chakra was faster than sound, bigger than a small building, and composed of thousands of blades that could slice opponents up even better than the sword that had launched them. Pain smirked in victory and closed his eyes as the blades of chakra bore down on him. Is that all you have? I'm disappointed. Pain opened his eyes as the attack was only inches from his face. Shinra Tensai. The blast of force from his Rinnegan blew the samurai's attack away with no effort at all. Pain began to gloat, but stopped when he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Looking down, his Rinnegan widened to see Mifune, katana embedded in his chest. The final draw was not my best attack, it was your own overconfidence. Even a genin's kunai is as lethal as your most powerful attack. Mifune ripped out his katana and swung again, this time removing Pain's head from his body with a stroke so fast the blood flew off his katana, resulting in a perfectly clean blade when he sheathed it once more. Your overconfidence was your undoing, said Mifune as he turned away. The old samurai stopped dead in his tracks when a large metal blade shot up out of the floor and threatened to impale him. Even given his attempt to dodge, his left arm was severed from his body. Looking to the attacker as he rose out of the floor, Mifune was struck by how much of a resemblance this newcomer had to Akatsuki's deceased leader. If the bald man before him had orange hair, he could easily see them as twins. And your overconfidence will be yours, said a voice behind him. Mifune whirled around to see a tall orange-haired man with many facial piercings and a long ponytail. As you will soon discover, Pain has many forms. Mifune spun around once more, tightening his grip on his katana with his remaining hand in case any of the unknown Akatsuki members decided to attack. The new one was sturdily built, with a short and spiky orange haircut and the same kinds of piercings. As does Pain. Mifune glanced to his right to see yet another new Akatsuki member that was almost identical to the beheaded man at his feet. This one had long and straight hair in addition to more facial piercings in his Akatsuki cloak. How many can you experience before you experience no more? Asked another version of Akatsuki's leader. Mifune had begun to piece together that the Pain he had defeated was nothing more than some kind of advanced clone, and that the real Pain was hidden among his copies. The last Pain was unique in that it was the only female of the group, with long orange hair done up in some kind of bun. Mifune became instantly wary as the ceiling exploded inwards, forcing him to slice some blocks of stone that would have otherwise crushed him. He was disheartened and glad at the same time that the newcomer was not another Path of Pain, but the blue-haired woman from earlier. She looked at the only Pain to have been defeated with a sorrowful look, but turned quickly to face the ponytailed Pain. It is time for the final phase, she said as a bale of paper vaguely shaped like a human descended gently out of the sky. Mifune realized that letting Akatsuki reach the final stage of their plan wouldn't be good for anyone, and took a step forward, only for the bald Pain to grab him in a powerful bear hug with 6 arms. The long-haired Pain smirked when he noticed this, and slammed his hand on the ground as if to summon something. What emerged from the cloud of smoke was surprising to say the least. Most summons were large, terrifying beasts used to strike fear into the hearts of any unfortunate to cross their path. They were not starving men with pure white hair in a strange walking contraptions, with dozens of black rods sticking out of their backs. The Pains around him all collapsed as the crippled man pulled his arms out of the tubes by his sides and brought them together into a simple hand seal. The ground rumbled as a large and utterly terrifying statue rose out of the ground behind him. The paper rose away from the covered figure's head, revealing the girl that the Raikage had claimed to be the last jinchuriki. She appeared to be unconscious, as she didn't react at all when the white-haired man placed a hand upon her head. The statue's mouth opened wide and the bit fell to the ground with a resounding thud as the man in the wok pulled upwards with a great flourish as if throwing something into the air. Mifune didn't hear, so much as feel the ripping sensation that accompanied the motion. The human shape made entirely of blue chakra flew into the air, pulling along an almost solid ball of black chakra condensed into the middle. Another hand seal was made by the mysterious man, and a chain made entirely of chakra shot out of the statue's mouth to impale the ball of black chakra before dragging it into the mouth, which closed sharply. The last eye that had remained closed opened instantly, and blood began to seep from the 9 eyes as the statue moved of its own accord to scream loudly, though the noise was likely lost in the cacophony of the many battles. The statue began to deform, stretching unnaturally, and Mifune was horrified despite the many battles and wars he had seen. Noting compared to this, the white-haired man raised a hand feebly to point at the mutating statue, and a long black rod identical to the ones Pain had used and the ones embedded in his back extended out and pierced the creature. The white-haired man spoke with a commanding voice contrary to his frail appearance. Sealing technique. Creation of the sage. Red chakra began to travel down the rod and enter the man's body, and his hair started to adopt a pink tint, before brightening into a vibrant shade of red. The technique didn't stop there though, and the statue began to be absorbed in its entirety. As the statue warped and disappeared, the rods emerging from the man's back fell out and the hole left behind healed themselves. The last of the statue was absorbed, and an explosion of chakra came forth from the man. When the chakra subsided, the contraption the man had been standing in had been destroyed, and Mifune saw that the man's legs were destroyed and crippled. Bringing his hands into another seal, a large demon head rose from the ground, wreathed in ethereal flames. The man hobbled into the King of Hell's open mouth, which closed behind him as the creature began chewing. When it faded, the man's legs were in perfect condition, and he walked over to the blue-haired woman with ease. She handed him an Akatsuki cloak while averting her eyes, and he donned it quickly, though he did not bother to button it up. Turning to Mifune, he let the leader of the samurai, who was no longer restrained, but held in place by awe and fear, get a good look at his eyes. They were similar to the simple ripples of the Rinnegan, but now there were 9 tomo in them, 3 per ring, though the 9th in each eye looked a bit more transparent than the other 8. It was nice of Itachi to tell me of Madara and his plans, said the man as he began to walk calmly. From the new angle, Mifune could see the black orbs of chakra that floated around his back. My original plan was an act of desperation, as I would not live very long after it was put into action. But with the information I gleaned from Madara's plan, I was able to make my own much more plausible. Before was just posturing. Now, I am a god in true, who will rule over an era of peace with an iron fist for all eternity. I am no longer Pain. Now, I am Nagato once more. It is a shame that you will not live to see it. Nagato grew 4 more arms, exactly like the bald path of Pain had before. Mifune struck out with his katana, but was blasted away once more by the same force that the Pain he had killed used. The 6 arms began to form hand seals as Mifune shot a blade of chakra at Nagato. It too proved useless as it was absorbed into some kind of invisible barrier that surrounded him. The 3 sets of hands all finished their seals at the exact same time, and Nagato turned to face Mifune, who stood aghast at the abilities his opponent had displayed. The black orbs of chakra began to form a large sphere around Nagato as if to protect him from something. A blow from the heavens themselves, called forth by God, shall usher in an era of peace, he said calmly, before the sphere of black chakra cut him off from Mifune entirely. Konan finally moved from where she had been standing next to Fu's dead body, exploding into a flurry of paper that exited the area as quickly as possible. Sasuke's Susanoo swung its blade of black flames, turning the water it touched directly into steam, as the last Uchiha tried to hit Kisame. Unfortunately, Kisame was far too agile underwater, and simply ran into the ethereal warrior again, siphoning off some more chakra simply by coming into contact with the being, an ability he had gained since fusing with his sword. It was only due to the insane amount of chakra that Susanoo consisted of that it was still protecting Sasuke. It even kept the water away, putting Sasuke in a small pocket of air. You're nothing compared to Itachi. Taunted Kisame once more. His flames were hotter than the sun, his genjutsu could trap anyone in a world only he controlled for days on end. And he would have wiped the floor with me before we even began. I can't believe you managed to beat him. That was when it dawned on Sasuke. Up until now, he had been fighting Kisame like Itachi, all Amaterasu and Tsukiyomi, flashing his Mangekyo Sharingan at every opportunity. The sheer power of the techniques had carried him this far, but Kisame was right. Itachi had been using his eyes for years. There was no way Sasuke could outdo a man who had lived with Itachi for years and seen all the techniques Sasuke was now using, but better. So Sasuke decided to stop fighting as Itachi, and start fighting like Sasuke Uchiha. Lightning style. Grand Chidori stream. The lighting chakra arced out from Sasuke in all directions, so potent that it forced Kisame to stop for a second and absorb the paralyzing chakra. Smirking in victory, Sasuke exploited that second for all it was worth, smacking the half-shark away with the Amaterasu blade in his warrior's right hand. It did little to actually burn Kisame, as he simply absorbed the fire through his skin, but there was so much raw chakra in the flames that it took a good second. A second that Sasuke used to swim out of the dome of water that Kisame had conjured. It helped that Kisame himself had been sent hurtling away, and the dome of water followed him, moving the edge closer to Sasuke. Gasping in the cold, sharp air, Sasuke fell to the ground, protected by his Susanoo, which faded once it had absorbed the force of impact. Sasuke looked up to see Kisame and his sword separate in the water. The figure was still tiny, and he owed the clarity of his sight to his Sharingan. Kisame ran through hand seals that even the Sharingan couldn't make out at such a distance, and the watery dome began to come towards Kisame, rising up into the sky above him. Kisame was carried up hundreds of feet into the air by the water as it took on the shape of a massive shark and turned around to fall on Sasuke and everything within half a mile of him. Sasuke could hear Kisame shout the technique's name across the distance as the colossal water shark bore down on him. Super Water Shark Bomb. Sasuke looked up at the technique, channeling chakra through his Mangekyo Sharingan. Amaterasu. The black fire traveled instantaneously to hit whatever Sasuke was looking at, and at the moment he was having trouble seeing anything but the giant shark bomb. Sasuke wasn't overly worried though. Amaterasu was so powerful it could burn other flames, and water was just one more thing to burn away. Sasuke began to worry when the shark continued to come at him. The Uchiha had no way of knowing that the technique was absorbing chakra from the black fire and converting it back into water almost as quickly as Amaterasu evaporated them. Sasuke shouted out in defiance and poured more chakra into the technique as Kisame roared as well, and his giant water shark seemed to swell for a moment. Then Sasuke's Mangekyo Sharingan began to spin violently. In his time training in the Hidden Cloud Village, Sasuke had learned to control the shape of Amaterasu with his other eye in order to create the sword that his Susanoo wielded, since Itachi's Totsuka blade had died with him. The Sharingan warped the fire not into a blade this time, but simply wrapped it around the giant shark. Kisame noticed and quickly ejected himself out of the tail of his super water shark bomb. The technique was designed to absorb any technique that it ate, but just as a shark can't draw sustenance from something touching its sides, the super water shark bomb couldn't absorb chakra from any technique not in its mouth. Amaterasu had no such restrictions, burning the water away just as easily from any side. Kisame's technique was now evaporating faster than it could absorb chakra, and quickly faded into nothing but steam. The shark man landed several yards away from Sasuke, catching Samahata out of the air without even looking. Nicely done, chum, said Kisame mockingly. Those were two of my best techniques, but I suppose an Uchiha won't be outdone in raw power. I'll just have to beat you into the ground the old-fashioned way. Won't be easy though. Samahata isn't really made for clean kills. But's what's a few gallons of blood between friends. Sasuke didn't answer, instead adopting a defensive stance as he prepared for Kisame's attack. There was little chance of him going on the attack with his leg as wounded as it was, and he could only hope Kisame would get cocky and make a mistake. He would be hard-pressed to win this fight though, no matter what happened. He was a bit confused though, when he noticed Kisame staring over his shoulder in awe. Turning to see what had caught the Akatsuki member's attention, he saw something that made him drop his sword in sheer shock. Eclipsing the sun was a massive meteor several times the size of the massive attacks the two had just been clashing with bursting through the clouds. Chapter 24. Naruto and the Raikage had smashed their way through the meeting building, trading blows and gaining bruises along the way until they came to the roof of the building. Deidara's explosions lit up the sky as Naruto faced down the leader of the village hidden in the clouds. Your lightning armor is impressive, but now that we're outside, I can show you why you never stood a chance. Summoning technique. Naruto slammed his hand on the ground, and Gamabunta emerged from the cloud of smoke. Naruto was about to tell Gamabunta to soak the area in oil, when he froze up at a bellowing laughter. Yano, Bunta old pal. You're the best drinking buddy a guy could ask for. Naruto slowly turned to look up at the leader of the Toads, who was clearly drunk, and the white hair man atop his head who was equally as hammered. Right back at ya Jiraiya, said Gamabunta loudly. The Raikage held off on attacking the flustered Akatsuki member, who had no idea at all of how to deal with this. Hold up, gotta deal with this summoner. Wait a minute, I didn't summon ya, said Jiraiya as if it were just now occurring to him. The drunk Sannin looked into the sky at the explosions and giant shapes and then tried to lean out over the giant toad's head. He failed spectacularly, falling down several stories and landing on his head. He stood up shakily, and looked around until he saw Naruto. Aha! Looking for a rematch with the fabled Jiraiya, eh? I'm more than happy to oblige. Summoning technique. Biting his thumb, Jiraiya attempted to summon Fukasaku and Shima, and while the resulting summon was about the right size, the goggle-wearing messenger toad wasn't quite the backup that the two elder sages of Mount Myobokuzen were. The small toad that Jiraiya had summoned though was very perceptive as to how bad it would be for Jiraiya to be stumbling around the battlefield drunk out of his mind. Let's get you back home before you end up dead, said the little messenger toad as he hopped up onto Jiraiya's head. Naruto didn't protest, as he had no wish to fight Jiraiya in addition to the Raikage, even if he was sure to win. The Raikage was all too content to not have to watch out for an intoxicated Sannin while fighting one of the most even matches he had ever been in since his father had passed away. In a cloud of smoke, Jiraiya returned to Mount Myobokuzen. Oi, I was drinking with him, yelled Gamabunta loudly. Naruto placed his hand on his face in exasperation, looking around to make sure that the Raikage wasn't taking advantage of the situation. I just need some oil, then you can go home and drink up a storm, said Naruto a tad impatiently. I'll even foot the bill for your next bender. Gamabunta went from glaring at Naruto to laughing up a storm almost immediately. I always liked you, ya know that. I'll give you your oil. Toad style. Oil bullet. Hick. Gamabunta slammed his hands together and spat out a massive quantity of toad oil. Swaying as he tried to balance on only 2 feet, Gamabunta dismissed himself in a cloud of smoke. Naruto enacted the second stage of his plan as the Raikage made ready to rush him. Running through his hand seals, Naruto took a deep breath. Sage art. Vaporizing wind. The resulting blast of wind was fairly random, striking with weak blows everywhere and anywhere. The results were less than spectacular, as the winds died out long before they reached the Raikage, but Naruto had accomplished what he had wanted to do. The Raikage rushed forth, and the lightning chakra coating his body ignited the vaporous toad oil in the air, causing a massive explosion. It was a bit of an unorthodox application, but Naruto had spent years traveling with Deidara, and that was not something that could be done without learning at least 100 new ways to make things into art. The end result was the Raikage being thrown past Naruto, carried by his own momentum and the force of the explosion. As the leader of the hidden cloud village went soaring past, Naruto delivered a powerful downwards chop that sent the Raikage through the ground and into the rooms below. The Akatsuki member jumped back as the lightning-clad man came bursting back up with a loud shout and an explosion of lightning. Rushing forward at insane speeds, he grabbed Naruto and bodily hefted the sage up over his head. Liger Bomb. It wasn't really a jutsu so much as it was simply slamming Naruto into the ground headfirst with a great deal of force. A sharp kick to the chin sent the Raikage straight up into the air, and while Naruto couldn't quite reach, Sage Mode was more than willing to extend the range of his blow. The Raikage landed deftly, looking at Naruto angrily before the entire building shook. Looking up in confusion as they suddenly found themselves in the shade, both Naruto and the Raikage were shocked at the size of the massive ball of stone hurtling towards them. Naruto looked around to see Deidara hovering in the air, barely able to move as well. Naruto shouted to her as he threw a scroll at her as hard as he could. Deidara, run! To her credit, she caught the scroll and only looked at it in confusion for a second or two before remembering what it did. Naruto meanwhile, summoned a toad he knew wouldn't be joining in Gamabunta's binge drinking. Hey bro, what do you need? Asked a completely sober Gamakichi. The toad boss's son had grown almost as large as his father over the years, and didn't talk so much as bellow. Holy shit, what is that? Screamed the toad as he looked up to see the gigantic rock hurtling down on them. That's why I need a lift out of here, and quick! Shouted Naruto. Gamakichi knew the routine, and quickly hit Naruto in the chest with his tongue. The adhesive usually used for catching bugs grabbed hold of Naruto as he was pulled into the toad's mouth before Gamakichi disappeared in a cloud of smoke. The Raikage looked down as his opponent disappeared and roared in anger before turning his attention to the meteor above him, ready to punch it into gravel if need be. Kakuzu was not a happy camper. He had entered this fight expecting to quickly kill a medic that was the last descendant of his most hated enemy, and instead he had lost 3 of his hearts before playing defense while the 5th Hokage healed every blow he landed as if he were throwing tissue paper at her. All in all, he was beginning to think that she might just defeat him as her grandfather had. But then that irrational fear passed when his overwhelming experience crushed it underfoot. He had entered this fight emotional, for him anyway, and paid the price. Now that he was in full control of his faculties though, he knew that he would win. The only question was how long he would have to wait in order to do so. The technique that Tsunade was using to passively heal herself used chakra, and like any technique that used chakra, it would eventually run out. However, Kakuzu was beginning to wonder just how much chakra the woman had stored up. With only his water and lightning hearts left, Kakuzu wasn't sure if he could fend off the furious woman who seemed to only pause for a second when stabbed in the heart by a bolt of lightning forever. He jumped back as Tsunade punched the ground where he had been standing a moment before, shattering it in a way reminiscent of a boulder crushing glass. One particularly large chunk of earth was sent flying at him, and it broke into pieces when it hit Kakuzu, who merely grunted from the impact. He might not be a natural with earth-style techniques anymore, but the earth spear was still a favorite of his, and he had trained in its use meticulously. His skin transitioned from the darker tone that signified its earth-style enhanced toughness back to the lighter shade that didn't waste chakra. Kakuzu looked up, ready to dodge another blow capable of turning bones to dust, only to see Tsunade breathing heavily. The Hokage staggered to her left a bit as the tattoos running along her body faded, taking her unnatural youth along with them. Facing Kakuzu now was an old hag who could barely stay upright. Your medical expertise appears to have run dry, Senju, said Kakuzu, trying hard not to breath in relief. I'll tell you this before I kill you, you certainly are a descendant of that man. Kakuzu clapped his hands together in a series of hand seals as he prepared to finish the line of his most hated enemy. Lightning style. False darkness. Kakuzu's last mask rose up over his shoulder and opened its mouth with a sharp crack as electricity sparked in its maw. Just as the beam of death shot out of his mask's mouth, the entire building rumbled. Unprepared, Kakuzu staggered a bit to avoid falling over, an action that threw off his aim by quite a bit. He missed the aging Hokage by a mile, and his beam of lightning tore through the walls and ceiling. Kakuzu had picked up many skills over his incredibly long career, and while he was no master at them, he could use some level of practically every ninja art in existence. Extending his sensory reach to try and sense what had caused the entire building to shake like that, Kakuzu became convinced that he had forgotten something very important about sensing chakra, because there was no way he was detecting a power that great coming from a single human. Still though, Kakuzu continued to try and look around, opting to ignore the wheezing hag on the floor nearby in favor of attempting to identify the threat as friend or foe. Extending his limited sensory range a bit further, and Kakuzu sensed something that had him running through hand seals as quickly as he could. He couldn't see what object was being dropped on the building, but anything with such a massive amount of chakra wasn't likely to differentiate between friend and foe. Earth style. Layered dome. Earth style. Earth spear. Kakuzu felt the drain on his chakra reserves without his earth-style heart to cushion the blow with a natural affinity, but he was still perfectly capable of using his defensive techniques. Kakuzu's skin adopted a darker shade as it became harder than diamonds, and several domes of rock rose up to obscure him from the outside world. Whatever that thing was, he would be ready for it. Orochimaru smiled deviously. He had joined Akatsuki in the hopes that he would find a suitable body from among those who opposed the organization, but he never once hoped to find someone as perfect as the Mizukage so soon. Two bloodlines in a veritable sea of chakra reserves was almost too good to be true. Not that any of those things would help the woman against him. Just sit still, and I'll make sure that it's over quickly, said Orochimaru as the Mizukage tried to catch her breath. The snake Sannin was looking just as fresh as the moment he arrived on the battlefield, right down to his impeccable Akatsuki cloak. If you keep resisting, I may opt for some DNA samples rather than your body itself. And killing you outright would be such a shame, kuku. I would rather melt my own body than let you get even a drop of blood, said the Mizukage defiantly. Orochimaru's ridiculous skill and refusal to stay burned, melted, or otherwise rendered dead made him the toughest opponent she had ever faced, but Mei was prepared to go to any extreme to defy Akatsuki, even if it cost her life. Ao's investigations into her predecessor's death had found Akatsuki to be responsible, and she would not disgrace the fourth Mizukage's memory by giving any less than he had. Too bad you don't really have a say in the matter, said Orochimaru as he snapped his fingers. There was a burst of movement as Orochimaru's snake bit down hard on the Mizukage's neck, causing her to scream in pain. A quick counterattack separated the serpent's head from its body, but the damage was already done. Mei Terumi staggered to the left as her vision began to blur. The poison racing through her veins wouldn't kill her, but she would remain unconscious until Orochimaru administered the anti-venom. I won't take your body now though, said Orochimaru as if she could actually hear him. As it stands, my current body is far superior, as I just proved. I'll have to make some alterations to unlock your full potential. As Orochimaru hefted the Mizukage's limp body over his shoulder, the building shook violently, threatening to throw Orochimaru off balance. The S-ranked ninja stayed on his feet easily and only raised an eyebrow as he sensed the massive chakra source. It appeared he would have to take precautions against his new body getting destroyed. Sasori felt pretty good with himself for manipulating the Kage into the perfect position to use his Red Army, but then he realized that the Kage gained just as impressive of an advantage. As it turned out, the wide open space of the roof that allowed Sasori's entire collection to run wild also gave Gaara more room to manipulate his sand. So now Sasori was looking up at the red-headed leader of the village hidden in the sand who was now flying. And while Sasori had wings on his puppet body, they were purely decorative. Well, not decorative per se, but they were pretty useless when it came to actual flight. The blades had been used to great effect when it came to separating body parts from bodies. Not to mention that the Kage's ultimate defense remained as effective at blocking poison-coated weapons as before. Sasori's water jets were a bit more effective, as getting the sand wet had the added effect of slowing it down, but by this point the Kage had enough sand standing by that some of it getting wet wasn't a real issue. Turning the sand to glass with his flamethrowers was little more effective, as it rendered the sand unusable, but Sasori had a limited amount of oil to ignite and throw at his enemies. Which left him with the brute force tactic of throwing everything but the kitchen sink at his opponents from over 100 directions at once after covering it in poison. Ironically enough, Sasori did carry around a kitchen sink just so he could say he was always prepared, but he doubted throwing it at the cage would help much. With his skill at sealing things away, it wasn't like it hurt him to bring along a sink. Just as the master puppeteer began to think about making a plan B in case his blitzkrieg of puppets failed, Sasori suddenly found himself fighting in the shade. Looking up once he saw that the cage was doing the same and not taking advantage of his distraction to win the fight, Sasori looked up to see the massive boulder falling from the sky. Sasori was confident in the ability of his puppet body to survive, especially if he retreated back into Hiriko. Just because it was immobilized didn't make it less effective armor. What is that? Gaara was a bit more preoccupied with the giant meteor falling down on their heads than Sasori was. Sensing no answer forthcoming from his opponent, Gaara raised his hands dramatically, calling forth all the sand he had brought, and all the sand that sand had created by grinding rocks into fine grains. The sand rose into the air like two gigantic hands to catch the meteor and arrest its freefall. It would have likely be unsuccessful anyway, but the Kage was also trying to catch the meteor. From what Sasori could see of the tiny figure, the Kage was attempting to catch the meteor with nothing but his bare hands. Sasori was Akatsuki's premier spymaster alongside Zetsu though, and he knew of the old man's ability to alter the mass of objects. It also wouldn't have likely worked, but accompanied by Gaara's sand, the Kage managed to stop the meteor dead in its tracks. Or they would have, if Sasori didn't take advantage of his opponent's temporary distraction. Sasori's hand snapped off at the wrist to reveal a small compartment that launched wave after wave of Sanban. With all of the cage's sand stopping the meteor, he would have none left to guard himself. This turned out to not be the case however, when the sand that Gaara was standing on instinctively shot up to catch the poisoned needles. Sasori was never one to bet everything on one simple plan though. He preferred to have plans within plans within plans. One of his many puppets leapt at the cage from the other side, aiming to impale him with the poisoned katana in its hands. The sand underneath Gaara's feet sprang into action once more, catching the puppet around the middle. It was clear though that it was stretched thin though, as Gaara had sunk up to his knees through the thin layers of sand suspending him in the air. Sasori grinned as he twitched his finger, prompting the last stage of his plan to execute. The puppet's head detached, suspended only by a thin thread of chakra, and spat out a large spike from its mouth as it flew toward the cage. Unable to dodge at such close range, Gaara winced as the poisoned spike dug into his abdomen. The sand that he had been controlling fell to the ground limply, dropping his body to the roof as he faded out of consciousness. Seconds later, the sand supporting the meteor dropped away too, and the added weight became too much for the Kage. It began its descent of death once more as the oldest cage struggled to hold it back, but to no avail. Sasori's red army disappeared in a cloud of smoke, resealed into their scroll. Running forward, Sasori caught the dying cage, quickly injecting him with a large syringe full of a unique poison. In addition to killing more quickly than his main poison, the mixture he injected the cage with now would also act as a weak embalming fluid, giving the master puppeteer more time to begin converting his latest conquest into a work of art that would last for all eternity. Sealing the now dead cage into a scroll, Sasori jumped into his puppet armor before the meteor could crush him and render all his hard work moot. He wasn't too worried about the meteor. Every member of Akatsuki would survive, probably. Deidara dodged another shape as it expanded midair to disintegrate anything caught in its area of effect. The fight had consisted of a lot of dodging, not that that was unexpected. When one ninja could turn opponents to dust if his attacks connected and the other could turn her opponents into bloody explosions if given the chance, it was a battle of who could not get hit longer. The Kage dropped sharply to avoid the small flock of clay birds that threatened to blow him to smithereens. He brought up his hands to prepare another box of death, when the dust style blinked out of existence. Deidara had been trained by the old man, and had seen him run out of chakra enough times to know what that meant. The leader of the hidden rock village still had more chakra than most Jonin, but the amount of chakra required to mix three elements in perfect balance and use them to vaporize literally anything used an amount of chakra absolutely ludicrous to any normal ninja. Grinning in victory, Deidara launched her newly crafted bird at the old man who had trained her. The bomb detonated uselessly against his rock armor, and the Kage prepared his counter-attack. Before he could launch rocks upwards to try and knock Deidara out of the sky, the clouds above him burst open, revealing a giant rock that seemed to stretch on for as far as the eye could see. At first Deidara was absolutely terrified. The Kage had trained her himself, but he had never shown anything even close to this level of technique. Looking to the old man in horror, Deidara noticed that he was equally as shocked by the presence of a meteor in the middle of their battle. Dismissing the idea that the Kage had summoned the giant meteor, Deidara began to wonder just who had brought this thing onto the battlefield, and whether Akatsuki could survive the impact of the meteor crushing the meeting hall. Deidara. Run! Deidara looked down to see her partner next to a large red toad as he threw a small scroll up to her. The bomber looked at the scroll in her hands in confusion for a second before she saw the small inscription of a toad on the side and remembered the plan. Tossing her newest creation over the side, she jumped onto her experimental six-winged hummingbird as it grew to a size more appropriate to ride on. She flew off as giant pillars of sand rose to try and catch the meteor along with the Kage pouring chakra into Hid-lightened boulder jutsu to try and stop the giant rock with his bare hands by making it light enough to lift. Deidara knew it wouldn't last though and tried to get as far away as possible before her old mentor lost it. Sure enough, the sand pillars holding up the meteor collapsed soon after, and the giant boulder began its downward motion once more. Deidara barely managed to escape the pull of the giant rock as it soared past, and the wind it generated was another problem entirely, but the wing power of the new hummingbird sculpture was enough to overcome it. The blast of rocky debris from the meteor crushing the meeting hall was massive, and blew Deidara further away from ground zero, something she was actually glad for. She had no idea who had leveled the meeting hall, but she wanted to be as far away from that ninja as possible. She didn't know of any ninja who could use ninjutsu on that level, and was actually harboring doubts as to whether it actually was ninjutsu. Landing in the forest, Deidara dismounted her clay sculpture and pulled out the scroll Naruto had given her. Unrolling the scroll revealed a complex sealing matrix that Deidara didn't want to even begin to understand. The wooden roller of the scroll popped out to reveal a small glass vial full of a red liquid. Deidara removed the stop from the vial and poured the blood onto the sealing matrix. Naruto had assured her that as long as some of the blood ended up anywhere on the seal it would work, but she was cautious and poured the vial out into the dead center of the seal. Running through the seals for summoning, Deidara slammed her hand down on the scroll, gasping as the chakra flowed out. A cloud of smoke erupted from the scroll, and Deidara looked up to come face to face with a large red toad. The amphibian opened its mouth slowly to spit out a blonde wearing a slime-covered Akatsuki cloak. Standing up, Naruto turned to address his ride. Sheesh Gamakichi, when did you last brush your teeth? Use some mouthwash every now and then, it won't kill you. Well fuck you too, bro. Shouted Gamakichi angrily. Geez, you save a guy's life, and that's all the thanks you get. Maybe I should take a page out of Dad's book and start charging you every time you summon me. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I guess if I start paying you in alcohol, you'll become a raging alcoholic like your old man, eh? Gamakichi brought his hands up quickly. No. I was just joking bro, said Gamakichi, obviously wanting to be connected with his father in a few ways as possible. Anytime you need help, Gamakichi will be the first to answer the call. Naruto and Gamakichi paused for a second before breaking out into laughter at the same time. Naruto turned to Deidara next. Thanks for that. We'll need to be on top of our game to take out whoever used that meteor ninjutsu. Let's just hope whoever that was doesn't do that again. That technique didn't care about friend or foe. Naruto gestured to the remains of the meeting hall, which had been taken from a multi-leveled building with large, cavernous rooms to a rocky field covered in rubble. No problem, yeah, said Deidara flippantly. Let's see if we can find anyone else who survived. Deidara stepped onto her hummingbird, and quickly created an owl for Naruto to ride on. Just as they were about to depart, the bushes parted to reveal Kisame. The shark man had Samahata slung over his shoulder with a limp body lying on the blade. Despite the wounds and general tiredness of Kisame, he wore the huge grin of someone who had just finished enjoying himself immensely. Well, apparently avenging fallen comrades feels pretty good. I'm starting to see the appeal. Kisame's grin drooped a bit though as he continued. But what was that meteor thing? I don't think any of us can do that. Was it one of the Kage? We aren't sure, confessed Naruto, shaking his head. We were just about to look for survivors. Care to join us? Kisame's grin came back full force as he dumped the body resting on Samahata onto the ground, crushing it a bit more with his sword in the process. Sounds fine by me. Let's go crack some heads. The shark joined Naruto on his owl, since Deidara's hummingbird was built entirely for speed and couldn't handle another person. They began the flight back to the meeting hall, or its ruins anyway, and Gamakichi hopped along below, falling farther and farther behind. Don't worry about me bro. I'll catch up, wheezed the toad as he struggled to keep up and failed miserably. Naruto smirked at his adopted brother's antics. Sure thing. I might even save you a piece of the action. Shouted Naruto back down to the toad as he and Kisame approached the ruins of the Land or Iron's meeting hall. They flew over the ruins, looking for anyone who survived the giant rock dropped on the building. Naruto jumped off of his bird, landing next to a pile of rubble. Reaching down with a sigh, he grabbed hold of the leg sticking out of the rocks. Usually anyone underneath the rubble would be dead, but the muffled swearing told Naruto otherwise. Ow ow ow. That fucking hurt. Who dropped a boulder on my head? I'll fucking kill him, shouted Hidan as he tried to pull his scythe out from under the ruins where it was stuck. Nice to see you too Hidan, said Naruto sarcastically. How did your fight go? Is that even a question? Asked Hidan as he dropped his scythe for a second and raised his fist to the sky. Of course Jashin's most faithful servant taught those fucking heathens what true suffering is. Turning back around and giving his scythe on last yank, Hidan pulled his weapon of choice out from under the rubble, only a little worse for wear. Yo, look who I found hiding in his bunker. Shouted Kisame as he rounded the corner. Following right on his heels was Kakuzu, who did not look happy about being called a coward. I wasn't hiding, I was not being crushed by whatever that was, said Kakuzu gruffly. It was a meteor, said Naruto calmly. We still don't know who summoned it though. I don't suppose it was you. No, replied Kakuzu simply. I just sensed chakra that dwarfed both you and Kisame's chakra reserves combined and decided that getting hit by that would be bad. It appears I underestimated my own Earth-style defenses and didn't hear the commotion end until Kisame cut them all apart. Wait, there was a meteor. When the fuck was this? Asked Hidan. Well, I'm not sure who it was, but you can rule out me and the Mizukage, said Orochimaru as he rose from the ground, creepily close to Hidan, who promptly freaked out. I wonder if any of my subordinates survived. As if triggered by his voice, a pool of water moved out from under the rubble before rising up and taking the form of Suigetsu. Man, now I have to dig up that sword. That's going to take a while. He lamented. Suigetsu looked up and came face to face with half of Akatsuki looking at him like some kind of curiosity and started to melt back into a puddle. I'll just start looking for that sword then. Just as he was about to dissolve completely, a spear of bone shot out of the same pile of rubble and impaled him through the chest. Not that it really mattered though, as he simply fell to the ground in a rush of water and stood back up several feet to the right. The boulder moved again, and Jugo and Kimimaro emerged, both looking much worse for wear. Kimimaro coughed up some blood, and Jugo collapsed on the ground as his curse seal retreated. Orochimaru looked to Suigetsu and sighed. Suigetsu, get these two back to base. Kabuto will patch them up. If I see that sword, I'll grab it. Could make for some interesting research material anyway. Suigetsu thought about arguing for a second, then remembered who he would be arguing with and meekly walked over to Jugo and Kimimaro. Picking them up, he began to walk around the members of Akatsuki, trying to not let his eyes off of any of them. As the two of them left, Sasori leapt down from atop some rubble. Well, it appears that we're all meeting up here. So did Konan, Zetsu, and Pain not make it. I must say I'm a bit disappointed in, what was that? Even to a non-sensory type ninja, the explosion of chakra was impossible to miss. Where did that come from? Asked Orochimaru, taken off guard for the first time since joining Akatsuki. There's no way I didn't sense that coming. It just appeared. As a ninja who sensed everything almost perfectly all the time, Naruto took it upon himself to explain it to the less aware Akatsuki, who were all worried about the dwarfing chakra source that had come from nowhere. Whoever that is must have been obscuring their presence. I noticed an area devoid of any chakra before, but I didn't think much of it. Somehow, he can erase his chakra perfectly. It was a worrying skill for an opponent to possess. Suppressing chakra was a normal skill, but erasing its presence completely was almost unheard of, especially when the chakra being hidden was this massive. The ground around them exploded outwards as a massive burst of chakra came out of the huge source of chakra. The members of Akatsuki tried to brace themselves, but the only one to hang on were Kisame and Sasori by stabbing Samahata and his blade wings into the ground respectively. The rest of Akatsuki was sent flying, landing unceremoniously on the ground. Looking up through the channel carved in the ground by the chakra blast, the members of Akatsuki found Zetsu and Konan on either side of the massive chakra source, hidden by their proximity to such an overwhelming force. In the middle stood a man none of them had ever seen before, with blazing red hair and small orbs of incredibly dense black chakra floating behind him. What confused them though, was the Akatsuki cloak he wore. Konan, Zetsu. Who is that? Shouted Deidara. Konan looked like she was about to speak up, but the unknown man spoke first, his voice carrying across the battlefield without really yelling. I am Nagato, God, leader of Akatsuki, and the one who will lead the world to peace. Any doubts vanished as Nagato both referred to Akatsuki's goals and his own godhood with the same exact vindication and belief as Pain had. Looking closer, his eyes were almost identical to Pain's Rinnegan, save for the tomo swirling around the rings. If you really are Akatsuki's leader, then what happened to Pain? And why are you attacking us? Asked Kakuzu as he began to charge his chakra in case he didn't like the result. Pain was my less perfect form. This is my real body, capable of using all the powers of Pain and then some. When I sealed the 10 tails inside myself, I cast off that imperfect body for my new immortal one. As for why I attacked you all, I would have thought you would have figured it out by now. I strive for a world of peace. What place would an organization as bloody and violent as Akatsuki have in such a world? Asked Nagato, not waiting for an answer to continue. The five-cage summit gathered all the darkness of the ninja world that lies in the open, and Akatsuki gathered the darkness that hides in the shadows. And now all that darkness shall be crushed by the might of God himself. But then why are Konan and Zetsu with you? Asked Kisame angrily. Past experiences had made the betraying of comrades a touchy subject for him. Konan understands the goal, and has from the beginning. She joined Akatsuki with the same intentions I did. Zetsu tried to usurp my control of Akatsuki alongside Madara Uchiha, and when I defeated him, Zetsu joined me, explained Nagato. Madara also yearned for peace, but his would have been a false peace. I shall guide humanity to a better future and rule over it with an iron fist for all eternity. That's it for this part. If you enjoyed it, then like, share and subscribe for the next video as it's going to be more interesting, and also check out my other playlists. Hope you would like them too.